The night the Alpha King buried his true mate, his wolf went silent. Not the kind of silence that comes after a storm when the wind drops and the earth holds its breath and everything feels almost peaceful. No, this was the other kind. The kind that lives in a chest that used to be full and now isn't. The kind that sits behind a man's eyes when he's learned how to look at the world without actually seeing any of it anymore. That was Kael, Alpha King Kael of the Ironveil pack, the most powerful werewolf ruler in 4 territories, feared by enemies, respected by allies, obeyed without question by every single soul inside his borders. A man built like war itself, tall, broad-shouldered, with a jaw sharp enough to cut stone and eyes the color of a storm that never quite broke. He moved through a room the way thunder moves through a valley, not loud, not fast, but with a weight to it that made everyone around him instinctively step back and make space. And he was completely, utterly empty inside. 7 years had passed since they lowered Seraphine into the ground. 7 years since he'd stood at that graveside in the pouring rain and felt something inside his chest, something that had always been warm, always been alive, just switch off. Like a candle being pressed between 2 fingers. Quick, final, no smoke, no ember, just darkness where light used to be. His wolf hadn't howled since. That was the part people didn't talk about in the open, but whispered about in corners. Alpha wolves were known for many things: their strength, their dominance, their primal connection to the instinct that lived beneath their skin. But what made an alpha king was the bond between man and wolf, the deep, sacred partnership between the human heart and the creature inside it. When that bond was whole, an alpha was unstoppable, magnetic, alive in a way ordinary people could feel just by standing near him. When it fractured, when grief cut deep enough to crack the bridge between a man and his wolf, what remained was something far more dangerous than rage. What remained was a king who no longer cared about anything. And a king who doesn't care, that is a terrifying thing. Because caring is what holds power accountable. Caring is what makes a ruler remember that every decision he makes lands on the backs of real people. Without it, power doesn't disappear. It just becomes cold, calculated, and ruthless in a way that doesn't even feel ruthless, because ruthlessness implies some part of you knows you've crossed a line. Kael hadn't crossed a line in 7 years. He'd simply stopped believing lines existed. The council chamber smelled like old wood, pine resin, and the particular kind of tension that only comes when powerful men are trying very hard not to say the wrong thing to someone who could end their careers or their lives with a single word. Kael sat at the head of the long obsidian table, one hand resting flat against the surface, the other curled loosely around a glass of water he hadn't touched. Around him, 8 of the most senior elders in the Ironveil pack shifted in their seats, exchanged glances, and tried very carefully to make their latest argument sound like logic rather than desperation. Elder Corvain was speaking. He was always the one they sent in first, older than the rest, silver-haired, with a voice like gravel wrapped in silk. The kind of man who could deliver news you didn't want to hear and make it sound almost reasonable. "My king," he said, leaning forward with both hands pressed together in that way he had measured, deliberate, like every word was being weighed before it left his mouth. "The pack is stable. The territories are secured. Your rule has been unquestionable." A careful pause. "But stability, my lord, is not the same as legacy. A king without a Luna is still a king." Kael's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. It landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water, flat, heavy, rippling outward in every direction. The elder stopped mid-sentence. Silence. Kael moved his gaze slowly across the table. Not threatening, not angry, just present. That particular kind of alpha presence that reminded every person in the room, without a single aggressive gesture, exactly who held the power here and exactly how little effort it would take him to use it. "We've had this conversation," he said. "We've had it 8 times in 4 years. My answer has not changed. My king, the pack elders are not the only ones raising this concern. This was Elder Marin, now younger than Corvain, sharper, with close-cropped gray hair, and the kind of directness that usually served her well. Today she was walking a razor's edge with it. The allied packs to the east watch Ironveil closely. A king without a bonded Luna sends a message of strength. Kael said it simply. A king who rules alone and rules well sends a message of strength. I don't take a Luna to satisfy the anxieties of neighboring packs. With respect, my lord, I don't take a Luna. His eyes met hers. Level. Absolute. At all. We are done. And just like that, the conversation ended. Not because anyone agreed, not because the concern had been addressed or resolved, but because when Kael Devereaux said, "We are done," the air in the room changed in a way that made arguing feel not just pointless, but physically impossible, like trying to push against a wall that didn't have the decency to even push back. One by one, the elders gathered their documents. Chairs scraped softly against the stone floor, murmured formalities, and then they filed out, leaving the chamber quieter than it had been before, and leaving Kael exactly where he always ended up after these meetings. Alone. He didn't leave immediately. He rarely did. He sat there for a long moment, eyes fixed on nothing in particular, the glass of untouched water catching the low amber light from the wall sconces. Outside the tall arched windows, the sky had turned the deep, bruised purple of late evening that hour just before full dark when the world looks like it can't quite decide what it wants to be. He knew what they wanted from him. He understood it even. Find a chosen Luna, a strong she-wolf, politically useful, emotionally uncomplicated. Bond not by fate but by agreement. Give the pack an heir. Give the kingdom a symbol of continuity. Smile at the right moments. Perform stability. The logic was sound. He could see every piece of it laid out clearly, the way a general sees a map. He just couldn't make himself care. He pushed back from the table and stood, buttoning the top button of his dark coat with the same quiet precision he brought to everything, not a gesture of warmth, just of habit. Order in small things, because the large things had long ago stopped being orderly. As he turned toward the door, the sleeve of his coat shifted slightly at the wrist, just enough to reveal it. The bracelet. It was simple, deliberately so. A thin band of woven silver cord, darkened slightly with age, with a single small knot at the center. Not a royal piece, not ceremonial, nothing that would mean anything to anyone who didn't know. Seraphine had woven it herself. Sat beside him one afternoon in the long golden light of an autumn that felt, in memory, like it had lasted forever, though it couldn't have been more than a few weeks, and woven it from a cord she'd pulled from the hem of an old blanket. She'd tied it around his wrist with a small, private smile and said, "So you always know where home is." He hadn't taken it off once in 7 years. Not to sleep, not to shift. Not in battle, though it had torn at the edges and been carefully, silently reknotted. So many times the original cord was barely there anymore, threaded through with new pieces that he'd replaced himself. Late at night, when no one was watching, he pulled the sleeve back down, straightened his coat, and walked out into the cold. The rain had started while he was in the meeting. Not a dramatic storm, just a steady, gray, relentless drizzle that soaked everything slowly and made the night smell like wet stone and pine. Kael didn't take the covered walkway back to the main keep. He never did. He walked the long way, through the open courtyard, because somewhere in the last 7 years the cold and the wet had become the closest thing he had to feeling present in his own body. The pack grounds were quiet at this hour. Lights glowed warmly in the windows of the residential quarters. Somewhere, distantly, he could hear the low sound of a fire and laughter from one of the common halls his people, living their lives, unbothered by the gray sky, ordinary and whole in the way that people who haven't lost the most important thing yet tend to be. He didn't resent them for it. He just couldn't reach it. He was almost at the keep steps when he heard it. Small feet on wet stone, quick, purposeful, and then a voice high and clear and completely unafraid in the way that only very young children and people with nothing left to lose tend to sound. "Excuse me." Kael stopped. He didn't turn right away. In 7 years, very few people had addressed him without a title attached. He turned slowly, with the kind of deliberate patience that wasn't really patience at all, but simply the discipline of a man who had learned to never show surprise. She was small. couldn't have been more than 5 or 6 years old, standing in the rain without a coat, dark hair plastered flat against her forehead, looking up at him with wide amber eyes that held absolutely zero awareness of who he was or why everyone around him tended to take a step back. She was holding something, a small, soggy bundle of wildflowers that were more stem than petal at this point, thoroughly defeated by the rain. She looked at him seriously, the way children do when they've decided something is important. And then she asked him the question, the one he hadn't been asked in 7 years. The one no one in his pack, not his elders, not his warriors, not his oldest advisors had dared to put to him directly. She asked it without hesitation, without ceremony, without any idea that it would land in the chest of the most powerful alpha in 4 territories like something small and quiet breaking open. She looked straight up at him through the rain, clutching her ruined flowers, and asked, "Are you lonely?" The rain kept falling. Kael didn't answer. He wasn't sure, in that moment, that he still knew how. The child's name was Leah. He found that out later. In the moment, she simply stood there in the rain, flowers drooping, amber eyes waiting with the patient certainty of someone who fully expected an answer and was prepared to wait as long as it took to receive one. There was no fear in her, no deference. Just that open, uncomplicated question hanging in the wet air between them like a lantern someone had forgotten to extinguish. "Are you lonely?" Kael looked at her for a long moment. Something moved through him, not emotion exactly, not the warm, recognizable thing that word implies, more like the ghost of it, the place where emotion used to live, registering the shape of an old wound without quite feeling it. He crouched down. Not something he did often, not something anyone standing at the edge of the courtyard watching would have expected. The Alpha King of Ironveil, folding himself down to eye level with a rain-soaked child who'd materialized out of nowhere and asked him the one question his entire court had spent 7 years carefully avoiding. He looked at her directly. Child to adult, the honest way. "Who are you?" he asked. Quiet, not unkind. She considered the question with the gravity it apparently deserved. "Laya," she said. Then, as though this explained everything, "I live near the east wall. My mama says I'm not supposed to talk to strangers, but you don't look like a stranger. You look like someone who needs talking to. Something almost nothing, barely anything. The shadow of something that might have once been the beginning of a feeling moved across Kael's face, there and gone. He straightened, looked once more at the child, and then turned toward the keep without another word. But he didn't forget the question. He didn't forget it at dinner, which he ate alone, as always. He didn't forget it during the hour he spent afterward reviewing border reports by firelight, the words blurring slightly at the edges because some part of his mind was still standing in that wet courtyard, crouched in the rain, looking into a small girl's amber eyes. "Are you lonely?" He set down the report, stared at the fire, didn't answer, not even to himself. The next evening came, the way evenings always came in Ironveil, slowly, with the cold arriving ahead of the dark, settling into the stone walls and the open courtyards until the whole pack ground smelled like winter trying to make an early entrance. The torches along the outer gate were already lit by the time Kael returned from his late perimeter walk, flames guttering sideways in a wind that couldn't seem to settle on a direction. He heard the commotion before he saw it. Not a fight he'd have felt that differently. The sharp spike of aggression that any alpha registers instinctively the way a hand registers heat before the brain catches up. This was something else. Lower, more persistent. The particular sound of authority being applied to someone who had no power to resist it. He rounded the last bend in the path and saw them at the main gate. 2 of his perimeter guards, both large, both armored, both doing exactly what they'd been trained to do, standing in the entrance with their bodies angled forward in that universal physical language of "you do not pass." Standard. Correct. Nothing that warranted attention. Except for the woman they were blocking. She was slight. That was the first thing he noticed. Not small exactly, but stripped down. The way people get when they've been living on too little for too long. Her clothes were dark with rain, clinging to her frame, and they were the kind of worn that went beyond simple use. The stitching at the shoulder of her coat had been redone so many times, The thread was a different color than the original, and the hem of her dress was frayed in a way that spoke of months, not days, of hard travel. Her hair was dark, soaked flat, hanging in heavy lines against the side of her face and neck. Her hands, both visible, one pressed flat against the gatepost for balance, were shaking. Whether from cold or exhaustion or both, he couldn't yet tell. But she was still standing. That was the other thing. Because everything about her said, I have nothing left, her body, her clothes, the visible effort it was taking just to hold her spine upright. And yet she was still standing there in front of 2 armed guards 3 times her size, not backing down, not begging, just holding her ground with a stubbornness that was almost painful to watch, the kind of stubborn that isn't bravado but pure, stripped-down refusal, the last thing a person holds on to when everything else is gone. One of the guards was speaking, firm and low. The gate closes at dusk. You'll need to seek shelter in the outer village and present yourself at the administrative house in the morning with proper... I can't wait until morning. Her voice was quiet, strained at the edges like something pulled too tight. I'm not asking for much. I just need to speak with someone in charge of... Ma'am, the gate is closed. Please. The word cost her something. He could hear it. Please, I have a... Step back from the gate. Kael had already stopped walking. He stood at the edge of the torchlight, half in shadow, and he watched her. There was no logical reason for it. He had no particular cause to intervene in a standard gate refusal. His guards were following protocol. Nothing about this situation required his attention, and he had learned long ago not to insert himself into minor administrative matters that his people were fully equipped to handle. He watched her anyway, and then she shifted her weight, and the movement lifted her face out of the downward angle she'd been holding, and the torchlight caught her full on for the first time. And the world stopped. It wasn't a dramatic thing, not on the outside. Kael didn't move, didn't make a sound, didn't do anything visible at all except go completely, absolutely still, in a way that was different from his usual stillness. His usual stillness was controlled, chosen, the deliberate quiet of a man who had trained himself out of reactive impulse. This was different. This was the stillness of a man who has just taken a blow directly to the center of his chest and hasn't yet figured out if he's still breathing, because he knew that face. He knew it the way he knew the bracelet on his wrist, the way he knew the particular weight of grief that had lived in his ribcage for 7 years. The way you know the things that have marked you so deeply they stop being memories and become part of the architecture of who you are, built into the walls, present in every room, never quite visible but always there. Her bone structure, the angle of her jaw, the line of her brow, the shape of her mouth, even pressed tight with exhaustion and cold the way it was now, he would have known it in darkness. He would have known it underwater. He would have known it at the end of the world. Seraphine. The name moved through him like a fault line cracking open, slow, deep, geological. Not a shout, not a gasp. Something far more devastating than either of those things. Just the silent, total collapse of 7 years of carefully maintained distance, happening somewhere so far inside him that nothing on his face changed, and the guards 20 feet away had no idea that their king had just been destroyed and remade in the space of a single breath. And then his wolf woke up. That was the only way to describe it. After 7 years of silence, 7 years of that terrible, hollow absence, where the other half of him used to be something deep in the core of his chest, cracked its eyes open. Not gently, not gradually. The way an earthquake doesn't build slowly but arrives all at once, full force, with no warning and no mercy. His wolf didn't just stir. It roared, not outwardly, not in any way anyone around him could hear or see, but internally, in that primal space beneath conscious thought where the man and the creature shared the same blood and bone. It came back to life with a force that nearly took his knees out from under him. A sound like a dam breaking. A heat that started in his chest and blew outward through every nerve in his body simultaneously. Suddenly, overwhelmingly recognition and want and grief and fury, and something so close to joy it was almost unbearable. All of it arriving at once with no warning and no filter. "Mate," his wolf said. After 7 years of silence, That was the first word it offered. Simple, absolute, unquestionable. Mate, mate, mate. Kael's jaw tightened. His hand, pressed flat against the stone wall beside him, pressed harder. A muscle in his neck moved. That was all. That was the entirety of what showed on the outside, the complete, terrible iceberg tip of what was happening inside him. Because it wasn't possible. Seraphine was dead. He had stood at her grave. He had placed his hands on the cold earth above her, and stayed there until his beta physically pulled him away because the pack needed their king to stand upright, and Kael had temporarily forgotten how. He had lived 7 years in the gray, silent aftermath of a loss that had reshaped him down to the cellular level. Dead women did not appear at pack gates in the rain. He pushed off the wall. He moved toward the gate. The guards registered his approach first, both of them straightening, the slight shift in posture that his proximity always produced involuntarily, the body knowing the alpha before the mind caught up. One of them began, "My lord, we were just—" Kael held up one hand. Not aggressively, just enough to stop the words. The woman hadn't looked up yet. She was still facing the guards, her head slightly bowed now, the earlier stubbornness giving way slightly to the very real and visible weight of exhaustion. Her breathing was shallow. Her hands had stopped shaking, or rather, she'd pressed them together in front of her to stop them shaking, which was a different thing entirely and somehow worse to witness. He stepped into the direct torchlight. He was close enough now. Close enough for her scent to hit him, and it did, like a physical impact, even through the rain and the cold and the long years. Something wild and warm underneath the wet, a scent that his wolf recognized in the same instant and the same wordless, bone-deep way, sending another shockwave through his already fractured composure. "Let her through," he said. His voice came out steady. He didn't know how. Both guards stepped back immediately. And finally, at the sound of his voice, the woman looked up. Her eyes were dark, exhausted, carrying the particular shadowed quality of someone who hadn't slept properly in longer than a few days, the hollowness around the edges, the slight unfocus of a person running on will rather than energy. They were also completely, entirely blank when they met his. No flash of recognition, no sharp intake of breath, no color rising in her cheeks or sudden stillness in her body, none of the things that should have happened. None of the things that would have happened if she knew him, if she remembered him, if any part of her registered what his wolf was screaming at the top of its lungs from inside his chest. She looked at him the way you look at a stranger who has just done you an unexpected kindness. Cautious, grateful, uncertain, nothing more. The torchlight moved between them. The rain kept falling. And Kael stood perfectly still, holding the full weight of 7 years of grief, and one impossible moment, looking at the face he had buried and mourned and worn on his wrist every single day since, and she looked back at him with eyes that held absolutely nothing. She did not know him. He opened his mouth, closed it. Some part of his mind, the part that had kept him functional through 7 years of emptiness, the cold, disciplined part, was already working, already cataloging, already reaching for rationality in the middle of something that was anything but rational. Not her. Can't be her. Resemblance. Similar features. A relative, perhaps. His wolf snarled and shut that thought down completely. Mate, it said again. No room for argument. No interest in rationality. Mate. He was still trying to find words, any words, the right words, or simply words at all when he heard the small feet. Quick on the wet stone. Purposeful. He had heard those feet before. Just last night, in this same courtyard, in this same rain. The little girl came from behind the woman she'd been there the whole time, tucked close, hidden slightly by the angle and the dark, and she stepped forward with the absolute fearlessness that was apparently simply her nature, and she grabbed the woman's hand in both of hers and pulled herself up to stand directly beside her. And then she looked at Kael, those amber eyes, direct, unafraid. The same eyes that had looked up at him last night and asked him if he was lonely without blinking. She looked at him, looked at the guards who had stepped back, looked at her mother's face, reading it the way children read their parents' faces, with a fluency and an accuracy that adults lose somewhere along the way, and apparently found something there that she didn't like. She straightened her small spine, lifted her chin, and then she looked back at Kael with an expression of complete and serious moral authority and said, in a voice that carried cleanly across the entire courtyard, "Why are you being mean to my mama?" The silence that followed was the kind that has weight to it. Every guard within earshot went absolutely still. The two at the gate looked at each other with the careful, neutral expressions of people who have made a mutual decision to have been looking somewhere else. Somewhere across the courtyard, near the north wall, someone who had been moving stopped moving. The Alpha King of Ironveil, ruler of 4 territories, unmoved by elder councils, unbothered by political pressure, a man who had not been challenged in any meaningful way in years, stood in the rain and stared down at a child who was maybe 6 years old, and was staring back at him like he owed her an explanation, and she intended to collect it. He didn't have one. He looked at the girl, then helplessly, inevitably back at the woman who didn't know him, who was looking at him now with those dark, exhausted eyes carrying a new expression layered over the blankness. Something confused, something slightly alarmed, the faint crease between her brows of someone trying to understand a situation that doesn't quite add up. She put her hand on the child's shoulder, gently, instinctively, the gesture of a mother pulling her child slightly back from a potential danger, doing it softly enough not to alarm, firmly enough to mean it. She still didn't recognize him. The rain came down between them, steady, indifferent, soaking through everything. The torchlight caught the sharp line of her cheekbone, the dark fall of her hair, the particular set of her mouth that he had spent 7 years trying to stop seeing every time he closed his eyes. His wolf was not silent anymore. After 7 years, it was awake fully, painfully, furiously awake, pressing against the inside of his chest like something that had been locked in a dark room for too long and was only now remembering what light felt like. It wanted him to move forward. It wanted him to reach out. It had opinions, urgent and inarticulate and overwhelming, about exactly how much distance should exist between him and this woman, and that distance was currently far too great. He held it, barely. He looked at the child one more time, at those amber eyes that were still waiting, patient and unwavering, for an answer to a question that had no answer he could give her. "Why are you being mean to my mama?" He wasn't sure anymore which question was harder to answer, hers, or the one she'd asked him last night in this same rain with those same eyes, the one that had followed him to dinner and into his reports and into the sleepless edge of the previous night. "Are you lonely?" He looked at the woman's face, at the confusion in it, at the total, complete absence of anything that should have been there. Something in his chest, in the place where his wolf was roaring and his grief was cracking open and 7 years of careful, constructed emptiness were quietly coming apart at every seam, made a sound. Not a word, not a decision, not anything he could have named or explained. Just the sound of a man at the beginning of something he didn't understand yet, standing in the rain, looking at a face that should have been impossible, and not walking away. He made a decision in the space of 3 seconds. Not the decision his wolf was demanding, that one was loud and unreasonable, and involved closing the distance between them immediately, which was not something he was prepared to do in the middle of a courtyard in front of his guards with a child watching. Not the decision his grief was pushing for either, which was older and darker and whispered things he'd spent 7 years learning not to listen to. The decision he made was smaller than both of those, practical, the only kind he trusted anymore. He looked at the nearest guard. "Have the east guest quarters opened, fire lit, food brought." A pause, brief and precise. "Now." The guard moved without a word. Kael looked back at the woman, at the child still holding her hand, still watching him with those amber eyes that seemed constitutionally incapable of looking away from anything they'd decided was worth watching. He kept his voice level, neutral. The tone he used in council meetings, in negotiations, in every situation where the most important thing was not to let what was happening inside him reach the surface. "Come inside," he said. "Both of you." The woman hesitated. He watched it move through her, the wariness, the calculation, the particular tension of someone who has learned through hard experience that offers from powerful strangers don't come without cost. Her hand tightened slightly around her daughter's. Her weight shifted back a fraction of an inch. "I'm not asking for charity," she said quietly. The voice was careful, dignified in a way that cost her something, given how she looked soaked and exhausted and barely upright. "I only came to the gate because I was told there might be work. Kitchen work, laundry, anything. I can work, I just need—" "I know," he said. And then, because he could see she was about to argue again, and he was not certain how much longer he could stand in the rain looking at her face while having a rational conversation. "Come inside first. We can discuss the rest when you're warm." Another beat of hesitation. Then the child tugged on her hand once, decisive, and that seemed to settle it. The woman exhaled something small and surrendered and nodded. He didn't walk with them. He followed at a distance, which was the only way he could manage it. His wolf did not appreciate this arrangement. It had graduated from roaring to something more sustained and more insistent, a constant, low-frequency pressure behind his sternum, the feeling of something immense, trying to push through a door he was holding shut with everything he had. Every time the woman moved ahead of him, every time the torchlight caught the particular angle of her profile, or she reached down to say something quiet to the child, or he caught another thread of her scent over the rain, the door shook harder. "Mate," his wolf kept saying. "Patient now, in the way that things are patient when they know they've already won and are simply waiting for the rest of you to catch up. Mate. Look at her. You already know." He knew. That was the problem. His wolf wasn't telling him anything his bones hadn't already understood the moment the torchlight found her face at the gate. The recognition had been total and instantaneous, and completely, categorically impossible, and he had spent the last 15 minutes walking through the cold trying to find a rational architecture around it, and failing completely. Dead women did not come back. And yet his wolf silent for 7 years, absent for 7 years, the hollow place in his chest that had defined every single day of the last 7 years was not silent anymore, was not absent, was here, furiously and undeniably present, pressing its nose to the glass of his self-control and fogging it up with everything it recognized and wanted and refused to doubt. He kept his distance. He kept walking. The East guest quarters were warm by the time they arrived. Someone had moved quickly. A fire already built up in the hearth, dry clothes folded on the bench near the door, a tray of food on the side table. Simple things, but good ones. Bread still warm from the kitchen, a bowl of soup that steamed gently in the firelit air, a small cup of something hot beside it that smelled of honey and herbs. The child saw the food first. She didn't run for it. She looked up at her mother first, checking, asking without words. The woman glanced at the tray, and something moved across her face that she controlled quickly, but not quickly enough. The particular expression of someone who has been hungry for long enough that the sight of food produces something closer to pain than pleasure. "Go ahead, baby," she said softly. The child went, sat herself at the small table with the self-contained competence of a child who has learned to take care of practical things, and began to eat with the focused seriousness of someone who understood, at whatever level 6-year-olds understand things, that food was not something to be casual about. The woman stood near the fire, not sitting, not relaxing. The wariness hadn't left her. She was still holding herself slightly inward, arms crossed loosely at her waist, weight balanced in the way of someone who hasn't felt safe enough to fully settle in a very long time. She looked at the fire for a moment, and something in the set of her shoulders eased slightly involuntary, the body responding to warmth before the mind could decide whether warmth was allowed. Kael stood near the door, the appropriate distance, the distance that did not communicate anything except basic courtesy. He watched her. He couldn't stop. "What's your name?" he asked, quiet, careful. She turned from the fire to look at him. And for a moment, just a fraction of a second, something moved behind her eyes. Not recognition. Something stranger than that. Something like the echo of a sound she couldn't quite hear. A ripple across still water with no visible source. Then it was gone. She looked at him steadily and said, "I don't know." The silence that followed had a different quality than the silences before. Not heavy, not charged, just open. The kind that forms around words that land wrong, or unexpectedly, or in a place that wasn't prepared to receive them. Kael didn't react visibly. He'd had years of practice at that. But something in his chest in the place his wolf was currently occupying with all the subtlety of a wildfire went very still. "You don't know," he said. Not a challenge. Just the words back to her, carefully, the way you repeat something when you need a moment to understand what you actually heard. "I don't know my name," she said again. The same steadiness, the same careful dignity. The voice of someone who has said this before, to other people, in other places, and has made a kind of peace with the way it sounds. "I don't know where I'm from. I don't know most things. About myself." A pause. "I woke up in a village about 3 days east of here. Several years ago now. I was in a field, apparently. A farmer found me." Her eyes stayed on his, direct and unreserved, as if she had decided at some point that the only way to tell this particular story was to tell it plainly and look people in the eye while doing it. "I had no belongings, no identification, no one recognized me. I had no memory of my name, my family, where I'd come from, anything before waking up in that field." Kael's hand, hanging at his side, closed slowly into a fist. "Anything at all?" he said. The control in his voice was absolute, extraordinary, given what was happening underneath it. She considered the question honestly. He could see her doing it genuinely searching, the slight inward focus of someone reaching for something they've reached for many times before, and always come back with the same result. "Feelings sometimes," she said. "Not memories, just impressions, like trying to remember a dream after you've been awake for hours. You know something was there, but you can't see the shape of it anymore." She looked down briefly, then back up. "Running. I sometimes remember the feeling of running very fast, and cold, and..." She stopped. Something moved across her face. There and gone. "And losing something," she finished quietly. "That one's the clearest. I don't know what I lost, but I remember what it felt like." The fire crackled between them. Across the room, the child made a small, contented sound and reached for more bread, unbothered and warm, and entirely unaware of what was happening in the charged, delicate silence between the two adults. "How do you know about the child?" Kael said. He didn't mean it to come out as rough as it did. He caught it and smoothed it back. "If you had no memory, how did you know she was yours?" And for the first time, something changed in the woman's face. The careful steadiness cracked, just slightly, at the edges. Not with pain, with something warmer and more fundamental than pain. She looked across the room at the child, and what came into her eyes was so certain and so complete and so entirely unqualified that it answered the question more fully than any words could have. "I woke up holding her," she said simply. "She was the only thing I knew. She's the only thing I've ever been completely sure of." The ghost of something, not quite a smile, but the ancestor of one, moved at the corner of her mouth. "I didn't need a name for that." Kael looked at the child, at the small girl eating soup with focused dedication, dark hair beginning to dry in the warmth of the fire, feet swinging slightly above the floor. Something in his chest turned over so slowly and so completely that it took him a moment to identify the sensation. He hadn't felt it in 7 years. He'd almost forgotten it had a name. It was the feeling of something mattering. He didn't know when she moved closer. He noticed it the way you notice a change in room temperature, not a moment of arrival, just the sudden awareness that something is different from how it was. She had drifted imperceptibly from her place near the fire toward the center of the room, toward him. Not much. A few feet at most. She wasn't looking at him when it happened, she was watching the child, her attention soft and maternal and elsewhere. She didn't appear to notice she'd done it. His wolf noticed. His wolf noticed with an intensity that was almost embarrassing, a surge of recognition and satisfaction that he suppressed with considerable effort, the instinct warring with the discipline, the creature inside him deeply uninterested in maintaining appropriate emotional distance from its mate. There, it said, warm now instead of frantic, with the tone of something that has been patient for a very long time and is finally beginning to be rewarded. You feel it too. You just don't know you feel it yet. She was 3 feet away from him now. He could see the fine details of her face in the firelight, the faint shadows under her eyes, the way her lashes were still slightly damp from the rain, the small scar at her temple that was new, that hadn't been there before, that made something primal and possessive stir in him because it meant she had been hurt, and he had not been there to prevent it. He was cataloging her. He couldn't stop. 7 years of her being gone, of the absence of her being the central fact of his existence, and now she was here, 3 feet away, breathing, warm. And he kept catching himself taking inventory of her the way you count something you thought you'd lost forever, and are still not entirely convinced you haven't imagined finding. She was real. Whatever else was true, however impossible, however inexplicable, however structurally incompatible with everything he knew about the world, she was real. His wolf had no doubts. His bones had no doubts. The only thing full of doubts was the part of him that had spent 7 years building walls specifically to keep this kind of certainty from ever reaching him again. He made himself take 1 step back. Just 1. Carefully. The way you move away from a fire that is exactly the right amount of warm, not because you want to, but because you know that staying closer will burn. He saw it when she reached toward the tray to pour water for the child. Her sleeve pulled back. Just a fraction. Just enough. Just enough for the firelight to catch the ring. Kael stopped breathing. It was a simple thing to look at a band of dark metal, hammered rather than cast, with a single inset stone the color of deep amber. Not ornate. Not the kind of thing that announced itself. The kind of piece that meant something specific to specific people and nothing at all to anyone else. He knew every detail of it. He knew the slight asymmetry on the left side of the band where the hammer had struck twice in the same spot. He knew the way the amber stone caught the light and held it, deep and warm, like something alive inside it. He knew the particular weight of it had held it in his palm, had placed it on a finger that was already cold and still, had stood in the gray morning of the worst day of his life, and understood that he was letting go of something he would never get back. He had buried that ring. He had buried it on her finger. He had been deliberate about it, in the specific and terrible way that grief makes you deliberate about small things because the large ones are too enormous to look at directly. He had made sure it was there. He had looked at it as they lowered her down. He had carried the image of it, that band of dark metal against pale, cold skin in the worst of his nights for 7 years. And it was on her hand. Right now. On the hand that was pouring water from a pitcher in a warm room in his keep, belonging to a woman who didn't know her own name, who had woken in a field 3 days east of here years ago with no memory and a child she was certain was hers. The ring that he had buried was on her finger. His control, which had been extraordinary up to this point, which he had maintained through the gate and the courtyard and the conversation and the unbearable proximity and all of it, cracked, not visibly, not in any way she would have seen, or anyone watching would have registered, but internally, in the structure of him, something gave way. Something that had been bearing tremendous weight for a very long time shifted and groaned and failed at one critical point, and the feeling that rushed through the gap was so large and so unmanageable that for a full 3 seconds he simply couldn't think. "She's real," his wolf said with a quiet and devastating certainty. Not triumphant, just sure, the way the ground is sure. She is real, and she is here, and she is yours, and she never stopped being yours, and you know it. Logic tried. Logic made one last valiant effort. A dead woman, an impossible ring, 7 years. There must be an explanation. There must be a rational. His wolf simply looked at logic with the patient, immovable authority of something ancient and primal and completely unimpressed, and logic went quiet. He looked at the ring. He looked at her hand, the way she wrapped it around the cup she handed to the child, the casual intimacy of the gesture, completely unaware, completely unself-conscious, having no idea what she was carrying on her finger or what it meant, or what it was doing to the man standing 6 feet away trying to remember how his lungs worked. He wanted to reach out and take her hand. The want was so immediate and so total that it shocked him, not because wanting things was foreign to him, but because it had been so long since he'd wanted anything with this kind of specificity. With this particular edge of need underneath it, his hand actually moved. A fraction, less than an inch, the beginning of a reach that his discipline intercepted and shut down before it completed. He pressed his hand flat against his thigh instead, held it there, felt the pressure of his own palm against his leg as an anchor. Not yet, some part of him said. The part that was still thinking, the part that understood that this woman was exhausted and frightened and had no idea who he was, that the child across the room was watching everything, that whatever had happened, whatever impossible, inexplicable thing had led to this moment, could not be resolved in a single evening in a firelit room by a man who was barely holding himself together. Not yet. His wolf disagreed. Loudly. He overruled it. She set the cup down and turned slightly, and for a moment her eyes found his across the room. Just briefly. That same slight confusion in them, the not quite recognition, the ripple with no visible source. Like standing outside a house you've never been in and feeling, inexplicably, like you know where the light switches are. She felt something. He could see it. She didn't know what it was. She didn't know why she had drifted closer without meaning to, or why looking at him produced that particular quality of unease, not fear, not discomfort, but the feeling of a word you cannot remember that sits at the tip of your tongue and refuses to come. She didn't know, but she felt it. And his wolf, watching her face in the firelight, was not silent anymore. After 7 years of darkness, after 7 years of that hollow, devastating quiet, it was awake, and warm, and absolutely certain. And for the first time in a very long time, so was something in Kael. 5 days passed. Kael gave her the east quarters, and asked nothing in return. He told his head of staff to see that she had whatever she needed: food, clothing, rest, access to the pack healer if she wanted it, and he made it clear, in the particular way he made things clear, that no one was to pressure her about her origins or her plans or anything else. She was a guest. She would be treated accordingly. What he didn't say, to anyone, was why. His beta, Daxon, broad-shouldered, sharp-eyed, 20 years at his side, and deeply familiar with every variation of Kael's silence, had looked at him for a long moment, after receiving these instructions, and said nothing, which meant he had noticed something. Daxon always noticed. He simply had the rare and valuable quality of knowing when noticing something and saying so were two different things. Kael didn't volunteer an explanation. He didn't have one that he was prepared to speak out loud yet. What he had was this. Every morning for 5 days he woke before dawn and lay in the dark, and had the same silent, circular argument with himself that he'd been having since the moment the torchlight found her face at the gate. The rational case, the one built from everything he knew about death and grief, and the fundamental irreversibility of certain events, was solid. It was coherent. It held together the way a well-constructed argument holds together, with clean joints and no visible gaps. His wolf demolished it every single time, not with counter-arguments, with something more basic than that, with the simple, unassailable fact of what it had felt when she came within range, with the ring, with the way she had drifted toward him without knowing she was doing it, with all of it, stacked up together into something that wasn't logic but was realer than logic, older than logic, the kind of knowing that lives in the blood and the bone and laughs at anything the thinking mind tries to put over it. He went about his days, reviewed reports, heard counsel, managed the machinery of his kingdom with the same cold efficiency he always had. He did not go back to the East Wing. He did not send for her. He stayed on his side of the distance he had set, and held it there with everything he had, because the alternative crossing it, speaking to her again, standing close enough to catch her scent and watch her not recognize him, was not something he was ready to survive yet. On the 3rd day he learned her name, or rather, the name she'd given herself, the name the farmer's wife had offered her in the absence of any other. A simple, practical thing. Sarah. She'd kept it because it was close enough to feel instinctive, she'd told the healer when he made his quiet courtesy visit. It felt like something she might have answered to once. When Daxon reported this to him, casually, between two other items of business, Kael had gone completely still for long enough that Daxon paused mid-sentence and looked at him. "My lord?" "Continue," Kael said. "Sarah." Short for the name he had given her in a ceremony under autumn stars, his hands around hers, the pack gathered. The whole world golden and certain in the way it only is when you're too young and too in love to know it won't stay that way. Seraphine. She had kept half of it without knowing why. On the 5th morning, he came down to the throne hall at the hour he always came early, before the court assembled, before the day's obligations arrived in full force. He used this hour for thinking, or more accurately, for the specific kind of thinking that passed for thinking in his life now, which was mostly managing the distance between himself and everything that might require him to feel something. He heard her before he saw her. The same small feet, the same purposeful sound on stone. He stopped in the doorway. She was sitting in the throne hall. Not on the throne on the steps leading up to it, which was somehow more disarming than the throne itself would have been. Sitting cross-legged on the middle step with her hands folded in her lap and her dark hair braided unevenly down one side. Self-done, he could tell. The imprecise work of small fingers trying to replicate something they'd seen, but not yet mastered. And she was looking at the tall arched windows where the early light was just beginning to come through the stone tracery in laced, long, pale bars. She looked perfectly at home. She looked up when he entered. Those amber eyes found him with the same direct, uncomplicated certainty they always had, as though his presence was something she'd been expecting and was not remotely surprised by. "I found you," she said, not triumphantly, just factually. Kael looked at her for a moment. Then he walked forward and stood at the base of the steps, looking up at the child who had made herself at home on the approach to his throne as though she owned the place. "You shouldn't be in here," he said. His voice was even, not unkind. "I know," she agreed pleasantly, in the tone of someone who has already weighed this information and decided it was outweighed by other considerations. "I came anyway." He waited. She looked at him with those eyes, and there was something about the way she looked at him that he had been trying not to examine too closely for 5 days, something that snagged at him in a place deeper than reason, something his wolf responded to in a way that was quieter and more complicated than the way it responded to her mother. Not the roar, something else, something steadier and older and more devastating in its quietness. "Mama is sick," she said. His whole chest tightened in one instant. He didn't show it. "What kind of sick?" he said. Not a question. A demand for precision, kept gentle. "She gets cold that she can't fix," Leah said. The child's directness was clinical in its simplicity. No dramatization, no performance, just the facts as she understood them, delivered with the matter-of-fact gravity of someone who has been the only person paying close attention to a situation for a long time. "She shivers even when it's warm. And she doesn't eat enough because she gives me the bigger part and thinks I don't notice." A pause. Her jaw tightened slightly, something small and fierce moving through her face, a version of stubborn that was achingly familiar from a direction he wasn't ready to look at directly yet. "She won't ask for help. She never asks for help. She says we don't need—" She stopped, reconsidered. "She says we can manage." She looked at him steadily. "But I think you should help anyway," she said. "Even if she doesn't ask." The throne hall was quiet around them. The morning light moved through the windows in slow bars, warm and pale, striping the stone floor between them. Somewhere outside, early birds. The distant sound of the pack beginning to wake. Kael crouched down, same as the first night in the rain, eye level, the honest way. "Why me?" he said quietly. The child looked at him. Something moved in those amber eyes. Something too layered for a 6-year-old to be carrying, something that made him wonder, not for the first time, what exactly lived behind that calm, direct gaze. What she understood that she didn't have words for yet. "Because you were looking at her," she said simply. "At the gate. You were looking at her the way people look at things they don't want to lose." Silence. He held her gaze. She held his. The morning light moved between them. And then, because he was crouched at eye level with a child who had just dismantled him with 11 words. Something made him really look at her face. Not the way he'd been carefully not looking for 5 days. All the way. The brow line. The jaw. The particular set of her eyes. The way her nose turned up slightly at the end in a way that was Seraphine's entirely. And the amber of her eyes, which was not Seraphine's, which was his. The thought hit him like cold water. He didn't move, didn't breathe, just stayed crouched on the stone floor of his own throne hall looking at a child's face while something enormous and silent rearranged itself in his understanding of the last 6 years. He stood slowly. "Go back to your mother," he said. His voice was steady. He didn't know how. "Tell her the pack healer will come this morning. Tell her—" He stopped. "Tell her it's not a request, that it comes from me." Leah considered this. Nodded once, decisive, satisfied. She unfolded herself from the step and stood and smoothed her dress with the small, dignified gesture of someone concluding a successful meeting. Then she looked up at him one more time. "Will you come too?" she asked. He looked at her face, at those eyes. "Later," he said. She accepted this, and then she walked back out of the throne hall the same way she'd come in, purposeful, unhurried, completely at home, and left him standing alone in the morning light, with his hands very still at his sides, and something enormous moving through him that he didn't have a name for yet. He called for Daxon within the hour. He didn't explain. He didn't need to, or rather, he wasn't ready to, and Daxon was smart enough to receive an instruction without requiring the architecture behind it. What Kael gave him was simple and specific. A medical sample was to be collected from the child, Leah, under the guise of the standard health screening the pack healer conducted for all new arrivals. It was routine. There would be nothing unusual about it. The sample was to be taken to the pack's genetic specialist, Maren Voss, and a full bloodwork analysis run against the Ironveil royal bloodline. Daxon didn't blink. He wrote it down. He looked up once. Kael met his eyes. Daxon looked back down. "I'll have results by evening," he said. "Morning," Kael said. "I don't want anyone working quickly on this. I want it done correctly." What he meant, and what Daxon understood without being told, was, "I need the extra hours. I need to exist in the state of not knowing for a little longer, because what I suspect is something I am not ready to know for certain until I have prepared myself to receive it." He didn't sleep that night. The results came before dawn. Daxon brought them himself. He arrived at Kael's study in the dark of early morning, while the pack grounds were still quiet and the last of the night's cold was still pressing against the windows, and he set a single folded document on the desk without ceremony. Kael looked at it for a long moment before he opened it. The fire in the hearth had burned low. The room smelled like old paper and the cedar wood of the shelves that lined 3 walls, hundreds of years of pack records living in the grain of them. The candle on the desk had burned down to its last third. Everything around him had the quality of very late or very early, that threshold hour where the world has temporarily suspended its usual rules and things feel both more and less real than they do in daylight. He opened the document. He read it once. He read it again. 99.9% concordance with the Ironveil royal bloodline. Paternal line. Direct. No ambiguity in the results. The specialist had run the comparison 3 times, which told him that even Maren Voss, rigorous and unsentimental as she was, had been surprised enough by what the data was saying to verify it twice over, before she would commit to writing it down. Paternal line. Direct. His. Kael set the document down on the desk. He pressed both hands flat against the surface and leaned forward slightly, looking at the page, at the neat clinical rows of data that were saying something so enormous and so impossible that his mind kept sliding off it the way a hand slides off wet stone. He had a daughter. He had a daughter who had found her way to his gate in the rain, climbed into his throne hall before dawn, sat herself on the steps like she owned them, and told him to go help her mother with the particular authority of someone who had no idea she was talking to her father. He had a daughter. The logic that had been fighting the losing battle against his wolf for 5 days gave up entirely. Not with a fight, not with argument. It simply laid down all the careful, rational structures, all the This is impossible, and dead women don't return, and there must be an explanation laid down quietly in the face of 99.9%, and a pair of amber eyes that looked like his and a little girl braiding her own, hair on his throne room steps and asking him to please help her mama. Something happened in Kael's chest. It started small, a crack, somewhere deep, the kind that starts at a single point and then travels outward through old material, through the compacted, compressed layers of 7 years of grief and blankness, and the deliberate extinction of hope spreading fast, following every existing fault line, every place where the structure had always been slightly weakest. And then it wasn't small anymore. A sound came out of him. Not a sob, not a cry, not anything dark, something that hadn't lived in his chest in 7 years. Something that his body seemed to have forgotten the mechanics of, so that it arrived rough and unpracticed and slightly broken at the edges. Kael laughed. It was disbelief and grief and joy and the specific kind of overwhelm that happens when something too large to process arrives all at once with no warning, and the body, having no appropriate response on hand, does the only thing left to it. He laughed. Not long, not smooth, but completely real. The most real sound he'd made in years, pressing one hand over his mouth as though he could contain it, looking at the document through eyes that had gone unexpectedly bright. A daughter, 6 years old, with his eyes and her mother's jaw and absolutely no fear of anyone or anything, who had apparently decided within 48 hours of arriving in his pack that he was someone worth talking to, who had asked him if he was lonely in the rain, who had made herself comfortable on his throne room steps and told him, with the calm authority of someone twice her age, that he should help her mother even if her mother wouldn't ask. Daxon was still standing near the door. Kael looked up at him, and Daxon, who had not seen his king laugh in 7 years, who had stood at that graveside and physically pulled him upright, and spent the better part of a decade carefully managing his own worry about the man he served, looked at him with something that was not quite his usual neutral, something that lived very close to the expression people wear when they are relieved about something they have been afraid of for a very long time. "Leave me," Kael said. His voice wasn't steady. He didn't try to make it steady. Daxon left without a word. Kael sat back down. He looked at the document. He looked at the fire. He looked at the bracelet on his wrist, worn and reknotted and permanently present, the thread of it carrying 7 years in its weave. He thought about a woman who woke in a field with no memories and named herself half a name without knowing why, who carried herself with dignity through exhaustion and cold and need and would not ask for help, who drifted toward him in a firelit room without knowing she was doing it, pulled by something older than memory, some deep current that ran beneath the floor of consciousness. He thought about a ring that he had buried. He thought about a little girl with his eyes. And for the first time in 7 years, sitting alone in his study in the dark before dawn with a document full of impossible numbers on the desk in front of him, Kael let himself, quietly and completely, believe that something was not over. That something, somehow, against every law of loss he had built his life around, was just beginning. He pressed his fingers once to the bracelet at his wrist, held them there, and outside, somewhere across the pack grounds in the East Wing, the morning was coming up gold. He went at mid-morning, not because he had planned to, or rather he had spent the better part of the hours between Daxon's departure and sunrise telling himself he would not go, that the appropriate next step was measured and logical. Have the healer's report delivered to him, review it, determine what care was needed, arrange it through the proper channels. Keep the distance, keep the structure. Do not go to the East Wing and stand in a room with her again until he had a better grip on what was happening inside him. He went anyway. He dismissed the attendant outside the East Quarters with a look and stood at the door for a moment, his hand flat against the wood. On the other side, quiet. The particular quiet of a room where people are sleeping. He pushed the door open slowly. The room was warm. The fire had burned down to deep orange coals that gave off a steady, low light, amber and soft. The kind of light that doesn't illuminate so much as it reveals slowly, gently, only the things that are already there. The breakfast tray on the side table was half touched. The dry clothes he had brought had been used, folded neatly at the foot of the narrow couch as though she'd wanted to make it clear she knew they weren't hers. They were on the bed together. The child was tucked close against her mother's side, one small arm thrown across her waist with the unconscious possessiveness that children have in sleep, the absolute certainty of their claim. Leah's dark hair was spread across the pillow, her face smooth and unguarded in the way faces only are when the person wearing them is completely, safely asleep. Her breathing was slow and even. Her mother's was not. Even in sleep, Sarah was holding tension somewhere. He could see it in the set of her shoulders, in the way her hand rested at the edge of the blanket with her fingers curled slightly inward rather than open the sleep of someone who has learned not to be fully vulnerable, even unconscious. Someone whose body has forgotten what it means to rest without reservation. She was pale, more than she had been at the gate. The healer had sent a preliminary note: low fever, mild exposure, the body's resources depleted past the point where rest alone would recover them quickly. Nothing immediately dangerous. Everything quietly serious. He crossed the room without sound. There was a chair near the window, low-backed, plain, the kind of chair that exists in guest rooms for purely functional reasons. He moved it to the side of the bed and sat down, not close enough to disturb, close enough that his wolf, which had been a sustained and present pressure in his chest since the moment he'd entered the room, settled into something marginally less urgent. Like a hand on the shoulder of something that had been holding itself rigid for too long and finally felt permission to ease, slightly, just slightly, without letting go. He sat there. He looked at her. In the daylight coming pale and even through the curtains, she looked simultaneously more familiar and more strange than she did by firelight. More familiar because the daylight stripped the drama away and showed him the simple truth of her face. This was Seraphine. Not almost. Not a remarkable resemblance. The mathematics of her features were ones he had memorized so deeply. They had become part of his internal architecture, the way certain words become part of how you think, rather than just things you know. This was her. Stranger because she was also, unmistakably, someone who had lived years without him. Not in the abstract, but in the specific, in the particular set of her jaw that had something harder in it than he remembered, in the fine scar at her temple, in the calluses he'd noticed on her hands the night before. She had been somewhere he couldn't follow, and had been shaped by it in ways he couldn't fully see yet and might never fully understand. He sat with both of those things at once, the impossible sameness and the real, earned distance. Sat with them the way you sit with things that don't resolve, not trying to reconcile them, just letting them both be true. His wolf was quiet. Not silent the way it had been silent for 7 years. This was different. The quiet of presence rather than absence. The stillness of something that has found what it was looking for and doesn't need to search anymore. It was watching. It was here, in this room, oriented toward the woman on the bed with every atom of its awareness. And it was, for the first time in 7 years, at peace. Kael rested his forearms on his knees and laced his fingers together and looked at her. He didn't know how long he sat. Long enough for the coals in the hearth to shift and settle. Long enough for the light through the curtains to move. Long enough for Leah to sigh in her sleep and pull herself closer against her mother's side, burrowing slightly, without waking. She woke the way people wake when they feel themselves watched. Not suddenly, not the sharp lurch of someone startled. Gradually, from the inside out, consciousness assembling itself in slow layers. He watched it happen. Watched the slight change in her breathing first, the shift from the smooth rhythm of deep sleep to something more uneven. Then the small movement of her hand against the blanket. Then the faint crease between her brows, whatever her sleeping mind was beginning to register. The awareness of something unfamiliar filtering through. Her eyes opened. Dark. Slightly unfocused for the first half-second. Then focusing and finding him and going still. Not afraid. He watched carefully for fear, and it wasn't what arrived. What arrived was something else. That thing he'd seen before the ripple without a visible source. The almost recognition, the sensation of a word on the tip of the tongue that won't come. Her eyes found his face and stayed there, and something in her went perfectly, almost breathlessly quiet, the way the air goes quiet in the second before something happens. Her hand had moved to the edge of the blanket. Her fingers were pressed flat against it. Her heart, he could hear it. Alpha senses picking up the shift with perfect clarity had changed rhythm. Not the slow, steady beat of sleep. Something quicker. Something that was not fear and was not entirely surprise, but was something in between, or something adjacent to both. Something her body had apparently decided about him that her mind was still trying to catch up with. He didn't move. "You're running a fever," he said. Quiet, even, giving her something functional to hold on to while the rest of her oriented. She blinked. The unfocused quality left her eyes, and something more deliberate came in behind it. She looked at him, at the chair pulled close to the bed, at the fact of him sitting in it, at the stillness of him, and he could see her processing, calculating, deciding how to feel about waking to find the alpha king of the pack sitting at her bedside. "You came here," she said. Her voice was rough with sleep, lower than usual, and hearing it at that register did something to his composure that he managed by being very still. "You're sick," he said. "I was told you wouldn't ask for help." A beat. "I was going to ask," she said. "When?" She looked at him. Something moved in her expression, almost wry, almost rueful. The shadow of a humor that lived somewhere underneath all the exhaustion and weariness. It was such a specific thing. Such a her thing. He had to look briefly at the middle distance to keep his face steady. "Soon," she said. He held her gaze. "The healer is coming this morning. You'll let him do his work." "You're telling me?" "I am." She studied him with those dark eyes, looking for something he could feel, the assessment in it, the same look she'd given him at the gate when she was deciding whether to trust the offer. Looking at him not as a powerful unknown quantity to be cautious of, but as something more specific, something she hadn't categorized yet, and was trying to. "Why?" she said, directly. The same directness Leah had, he realized, that absolute, uncomplicated willingness to ask the question most people would circle around indefinitely. "Why are you here? Why do you care? Why does a man like you sit at the bedside of a woman he met 4 days ago and speak to her like what?" He wondered what she would finish that sentence with if she said it out loud. Like he knew her. Like she was already his responsibility. Like the idea of her fever going unattended was not something he was capable of tolerating. "Because you're in my pack now," he said. "Everyone in my pack is my responsibility." She held his eyes for a long moment. She didn't entirely believe him, he could see that. Not disbelief exactly. Just the clear-eyed recognition of someone who has learned to look at what's actually true rather than what's being said, and who could tell those two things weren't the same here. But she didn't push it. "All right," she said quietly. Beside her, Leah stirred, small eyes opened, found Kael, and instead of surprise, instead of the wariness that any reasonable child should feel upon waking to find a stranger beside the bed, a slow, private smile broke across her face, like someone who had arranged something and was pleased to find it had worked out. She looked at her mother, then at Kael, then back at her mother. "I told you he'd come," she said, with the serene satisfaction of someone whose faith in their own judgment has just been vindicated, and tucked herself back against her mother's side and closed her eyes again. A silence. Sarah looked at her daughter, then at Kael. He saw the moment she understood that Leah had gone to find him, that this child, this small, fearless, completely ungovernable child, had walked across the pack grounds before dawn and made her case to the Alpha King directly. Something moved across her face, complicated, layered, something that was trying to be exasperation and kept collapsing back into something softer. She looked at Kael again. He held her gaze. His wolf was very close to the surface right now, not pressing, just present, like something that had waited long enough and was content simply not to be pushed back anymore. Her heartbeat was still quick. She still didn't know why. The healer came. He did his work, thorough and quiet, and he left Kael with a short list of what was needed: warmth, consistent meals, rest without interruption, a course of the pack's standard herbal medicine for the fever, and, in the healer's careful, professional phrasing, significantly improved living conditions. He said it neutrally, the way people say things to kings when they want to convey weight without applying pressure. He packed his bag and he left. Kael stood in the doorway looking at the room. Significantly improved living conditions. He looked at the narrow bed, the half-touched breakfast tray, the folded clothes at the foot of the couch. The careful, minimal way she had arranged herself in the space, taking up the least possible amount of it, touching the least possible number of things, as though she was still deciding whether she was allowed to be here at all. He made the decision the same way he made most decisions, completely and without ceremony. He went to find his head of staff. By afternoon it was done. The west wing of the main palace held 4 residential suites, large, well-appointed, connected by a shared corridor, traditionally reserved for visiting allied alphas and high-ranking guests. The largest of them had been closed for years. Its windows looked out over the pack gardens, which in early autumn were still running amber and dark red, and the light that came through them in the afternoon was the warm, oblique kind that made everything look like the inside of something safe. Kael had it opened, aired, fully furnished, and prepared with the same efficiency his people brought to everything when they understood a thing was not a question. He went to the east wing himself to tell her. She was sitting up when he arrived, which was already an improvement, sitting in the chair by the window with a cup of tea from the healer's prescription held between both hands, the child cross-legged on the floor beside her, with a book she was not quite old enough to read alone, but was working through with evident determination regardless. The fever had come down slightly. A little color had returned to her face. She looked at him when he entered with that same clear, assessing look. Waiting, he told her. Simply. She was moving to the west wing, both of them, today. The hesitation that crossed her face was immediate and familiar. He could see the shape of it before she even opened her mouth. The pride, the wariness, the reflexive resistance to anything that felt like charity or obligation. "That's too much," she said. "I don't need. You need warmth and uninterrupted rest." He kept his voice level. "The East guest quarters aren't equipped for that long term. The West Wing is." "I'm not long term," she said. "I told you I was looking for work. You can discuss work when you're well." He met her eyes. "This isn't a negotiation. You're in my pack. I don't leave people in my pack under-resourced when it's in my power to address it." He paused. "It's not charity. It's how things work here." She looked at him for a long moment. That ripple again behind her eyes. The unnamed, almost recognition. The words she couldn't find. Her hands tightened slightly around the cup. "Mama," Leah said, without looking up from her book. "He's not going to change his mind." Another silence. The corner of Sarah's mouth moved. Just barely. Just enough. "Fine," she said quietly. The whispers started before evening. Kael had expected them. He had not expected them to be quite so fast, but then packs were breathing organisms, and information moved through them the way blood moves through a body, following its own routes, arriving where it arrived without asking permission. By the time the last of the West Wing move was complete, the talk had already begun in the kitchens, in the guard barracks, in the corridors that ran between the administrative buildings where the pack elders kept their offices. The Alpha has moved a woman into the palace. An unknown woman. A human. No family, no pack lineage, no memory of where she came from. A child in tow. No father mentioned. Installed in the West Wing, guest quarters, the Alpha's residential corridor. The elders came to him that same evening. Elder Corvain first, of course, with 2 others flanking him, wearing the particular expression of people who have rehearsed what they intend to say, and are now trying to remain committed to it in the face of the man they're saying it to. Corvain was measured. He was always measured. He laid it out with the careful phrasing of someone who understood the ground he was walking on and was trying not to make any sudden movements. The pack had concerns. The allies would have questions. The nature of the woman's presence in the palace, given the Alphas his pause, was careful attention toward her, raised questions about intention and about the succession, about what signal was being sent to the broader territory. And then, because the elders were nothing if not thorough, Elder Marin stepped forward and said it plainly. The thing they were actually here to say, beneath the political scaffolding. A human woman with no memory, no bloodline, no pack standing cannot be Luna, she said. Firm. Not cruel, she wasn't a cruel woman. but certain in the way that people are certain when they believe they are being pragmatic on behalf of something they genuinely care about. My lord, we understand whatever you believe about this woman. Whatever your instincts are telling you, the pack cannot follow a Luna they cannot verify, cannot trust, cannot— She already is. 3 words, quiet as everything else he said, landing in the room with the absolute, immovable weight of a decision that had been made somewhere far below the level of debate. The elders went still. Kael looked at Elder Marin calmly, then at Corvain, then across all 3 of them with the unhurried certainty of a man who is not issuing a challenge because challenges imply the possibility of a different outcome, and there is no different outcome here. She is my mate, he said. She carries my ring and my bloodline. She is already Luna. The rest is process. He looked at Corvain specifically. Manage it. The silence in the room had the quality of a held breath. My lord, Corvain began carefully. The pack will not— The pack, Kael said, with the same quiet, will follow. They always have. He let that settle for exactly 2 seconds. We're done here. The elders left. Kael stood in the room after them and looked at the fire for a moment. Somewhere in the west wing, across the residential corridor, a child was probably rearranging furniture to her satisfaction and explaining to her mother exactly why each piece belonged somewhere different than where it had been placed. Her mother was probably too tired to argue and slightly smiling about it anyway. He pressed his thumb once to the bracelet at his wrist, let her already settle inside him like something that had always been true and was only now being said out loud. Outside, the pack was whispering. Inside, his wolf was quiet and warm and completely uninterested in what the pack was whispering about. She was here. She was in the palace. And the Alpha King of Ironveil, who had not yielded on a single thing in 7 years, who had not bent to elders or politics or the slow accumulation of pressure that came with ruling alone, was not going to start yielding now. Not about this. Not about her. Never about her. He didn't bring the pack healer this time. He sent for physician Aldrich Voss, no relation to the genetic specialist, simply the misfortune of a common surname in a small territory, who was the finest medical mind in 4 pack regions, and who operated out of a private practice in the Ironveil capital that catered exclusively to high-ranking wolves and visiting dignitaries. Aldrich was 60, precise, humorless in the particular way of people who have spent their lives dealing with things that are too serious for levity, and he had examined Kael himself twice in the last decade, which meant he was one of perhaps 6 people alive who had seen the Alpha King in a genuinely vulnerable state and could be trusted completely with what he found there. He arrived the following morning with a case of equipment that looked like it belonged in a university research facility, and the expression of a man who had been told very little and expected to need to know quite a lot. Kael met him at the gate personally, which told Aldrich, without a word being exchanged, exactly how serious this was. Sarah sat in the chair by the window when they came in. She had been up since before Kael arrived, he could tell, not just from the made bed, but from the quality of her alertness, the way people look when they've been awake for a while and have been thinking. She looked at Aldrich with the careful, neutral face of someone who had been examined by enough strangers over the years to have perfected the art of submitting to medical scrutiny without revealing how much she disliked it. Leah was not in the room Kael had arranged for her to spend the morning with Daxon's youngest, a request that Daxon had received with an entirely straight face and executed without comment. The examination took 2 hours. Kael did not leave the room. He stood near the window with his arms crossed and watched the whole thing not intrusively, not in a way that interfered, but with the steady, unmovable presence of someone who has decided that he is going to be here, and that is simply a fact about the room now. Sarah glanced at him once, early on, as though she might say something about it. She didn't. She looked at Aldrich and answered his questions and let him work. Kael watched her face throughout. Every question she deflected. Every moment of the examination where he saw her go somewhere else internally, not checked out, not uncooperative, just the practiced distance of someone who has made a long habit of staying slightly above her own experience, because that's the only way to get through it. He watched that and felt something tighten in his chest that was not grief exactly, and was not quite anger yet, and was looking very much like the early stages of both. Aldrich finished. He closed his case. He sat down across from Sarah with the practiced, neutral calm of someone who has delivered difficult information many times and has a whole architecture built for it. He told her what he found. The memory loss was not organic. It was not a degenerative condition, not a developmental anomaly, not the result of illness or gradual deterioration. The scarring on the right temporal lobe visible on the imaging, significant, the kind that didn't grow over time but had been there, unchanged, from the point of injury was consistent with severe blunt trauma. Something deliberate. Something applied with force to the side of her head with enough precision and enough violence to disrupt the memory consolidation centers of the brain catastrophically and permanently. Permanently. He used the word carefully, and then he explained what it meant and what it didn't mean, because in medicine, permanent was rarely as absolute as it sounded. The damage itself was not reversible. The tissue was scarred, not dead. There were cases, not many, but documented, of partial recovery over time. Not restoration of what was lost, but the building of new pathways around the scarred tissue. Memory fragments surfacing not as recovered files, but as reconstructed impressions. The feelings she had described, running, cold, the sensation of losing something, were consistent with exactly this kind of partial peripheral recovery. Echoes from pathways that hadn't been fully severed. What had been severed was the direct route, the clear road back. Whether anything else would surface, and when, and how completely that was, not something medicine could promise or predict. It would depend on environment, on emotional safety, on whatever triggers the brain decided, in its own time, to respond to. Aldrich closed his notes. Whoever did this, he said, with the careful neutrality of a man trying not to say what he actually thought in front of a patient, knew what they were doing. This was not an accident or a fall. He paused. This was targeted. The room was very quiet. Sarah was looking at her hands in her lap. Her face was composed. The kind of composed that takes real effort, not blank, not shut down, but held. Deliberately, carefully held together at the seams. Aldrich excused himself to give them a moment, which was either professional courtesy or self-preservation, and probably both. The door closed behind him. Kael didn't move for a long moment. He stood at the window with his arms still crossed and the morning light coming in pale and ordinary around him, and he processed what had just been laid out in measured medical language in front of him. His wolf was not making noise. His wolf had gone the particular kind of quiet that it went, when what was happening was too large and too specific for any noise to be appropriate. The quiet of something that has just understood the shape of what was done to its mate and is deciding, with cold and total clarity, what it intends to do about that. His jaw was tight. His shoulders had moved not much, not dramatically, just the slight, involuntary forward shift that happened when the body prepared itself for something it hadn't been consciously directed toward yet. His hands, still crossed over his chest, had become fists. Someone had done this to her deliberately. Someone had taken a weapon to the side of his mate's head with enough force and enough precision to strip her of every memory she had. Of her name, of their life, of him, of their daughter. Had taken 7 years from her in a single act of targeted, calculated violence, and then apparently ensured that no one went looking because in 7 years no one had come to that eastern village. No one had asked about the woman found in a field. No one had claimed her, or searched for her, or made any of the noise that gets made when someone is genuinely lost and genuinely missed, which meant someone had also made sure she would not be found. The fury that moved through him was very cold and very quiet, and therefore much more dangerous than anything loud would have been. It didn't announce itself. It simply arrived, fully formed, settling into him with the particular weight of something he recognized, not rage, which burned and spent itself, but the other thing, the thing that was capable of patience, that could hold a purpose for years, without losing an ounce of its precision. He was going to find who had done this. He was going to find them, and he was going to take his time doing it, and he was going to be thorough. Something in the quality of his stillness changed the temperature of the room. "Please don't look like that." Her voice, quiet, a little rough still from the lingering fever, but steady in a way that cut directly through the cold that had been assembling itself inside him. He turned. She was looking at him. From the chair. Dark eyes direct and slightly worried, not for herself, he realized. For everyone else in the building. The look of someone who has been watching a very controlled man come extremely close to no longer being controlled and has decided, apparently, that this is her problem to address. It scares everyone, she said. Her voice was careful. Not afraid, she was notably, specifically not afraid of him, which was its own thing to process, just deliberate. Like someone talking someone back from an edge they can see as close. He looked at her, and the cold that had been building, the gathered weight of it, the whole dangerous architecture of the fury he'd been quietly constructing eased. Not dissolved, not resolved, but eased, the way a fist slowly opens, the way a breath that's been held finally gets released. Because she was looking at him. She was sitting in a chair 4 feet away from him, having just been told that someone had deliberately fractured her mind, and she was looking at him with worry in her eyes about the effect his expression was having on the people around him. She reached out. Her hand found his forearm. Light, barely touching, the tips of her fingers against the inside of his arm, just below the bracelet, just above the wrist, the most tentative contact, the kind that asks rather than takes. She probably wasn't fully aware she'd done it. Her eyes were still on his face, still reading him, still working whatever private calculus she was running, but her hand was on his arm. And the thing that happened inside him when it landed there was so immediate and so complete and so far beyond his ability to be clinical about that he simply held very still and did not move and did not speak until he was certain his primacy a 7 voice would come out level. "I'm fine," he said. She looked at him steadily. She did not remove her hand. "No, you're not," she said. "A beat." "No," he agreed quietly. "Not at the moment." She held his gaze. Her fingers stayed where they were. His wolf was doing the thing it did now in her proximity, that deep, sustained warmth, that bone-certain rightness, and he let himself feel it rather than managing it, just for the length of that moment, while her hand was on his arm and her eyes were on his face and the morning light was coming in around them both. Then she drew her hand back, carefully, and looked out the window. "I'm not afraid of knowing," she said, more to the window than to him. "Whatever happened, I'd rather know than not." A pause. "I just need to know my daughter is safe while I find out." "She is," he said. "No qualification. No condition. Just the absolute and unconditional weight of a promise." She looked back at him, and for a moment, just a fraction, just a heartbeat, something in her eyes went very still and very deep, like looking down into water and catching the flash of something far below the surface. There and gone, the unnamed thing, again, the almost. She looked away first, but her heartbeat, which he could still hear with perfect clarity, didn't slow for a long time after. He put Daxon on it that same afternoon. Full resource allocation. No ceiling on budget. No limitation on scope. Every investigative asset the Ironveil pack possessed, and they possessed considerable ones, because Kael had spent 7 years building the kind of intelligence infrastructure that a king builds when he has nothing else to pour himself into. He wanted everything. The official record of Seraphine's death, every document, every witness signature, every chain of custody for the paperwork. He wanted the burial records, the medical reports from the night she was brought in, the names of everyone present. He wanted it all pulled and laid on his desk, and he wanted to know who had touched what and when. It took 3 days to begin to see the shape of it. What the shape said was this: someone had been very, very careful. The death record was real-filed properly, stamped, witnessed, archived in 3 separate locations. But the medical report that preceded it was missing from 2 of those archives and showed clear signs of replacement in the 3rd different paper stock, subtle misalignment in the formatting, the kind of details that only became visible when you were specifically looking for them. The attending physician listed on the report had died 14 months after the event, in what had been recorded as a travel accident. The 2 nurses listed had both left pack service within the same year. One had relocated to a territory 4 regions east and died of illness 2 years later. The other simply gone. No forwarding record. No exit documentation. A name that ended abruptly in a bureaucratic void. Witnesses that disappeared. Records that were replaced. A clean, professional vanishment of every thread that might have led somewhere. Kael read all of it, spread across his desk in the late evenings, after the day's official business was concluded. After the pack had gone quiet, he read it and reread it, and built a picture from the pieces that remained, like a man reconstructing a broken thing from the fragments that hadn't been swept up. He was not the only one awake at those hours. The first night, she appeared at the door of his study at the 10th hour. He heard her coming, soft footsteps, unhurried, the particular cadence of someone who has been awake for a while and is moving through a quiet building with the ease of someone who has made a map of it in their head. He wasn't surprised when she knocked. He was only slightly surprised when, after he said nothing because he hadn't decided yet whether to acknowledge it, she knocked again and then simply opened the door. She was carrying a cup. Tea. 2 of them, actually 1 in each hand. The pack healer's herbal prescription in one, and something darker and warmer smelling in the other. She stood in the doorway and looked at the desk covered in documents, and then at him, and then back at the desk with the particular expression of someone who has walked in on something they recognize. "Leah's asleep," she said. "I couldn't." He looked at her for a moment. Then he moved a stack of papers to make room on the corner of the desk. She came in. She set 1 cup near the papers, the darker one, the warmer-smelling one, which turned out to be black tea with something faintly spiced in it, and the fact that she had made the correct assumption about what he would prefer rather than what was medically recommended told him she'd been paying more attention than he'd realized, and she sat down in the chair across from the desk that was not quite close enough to see the documents but was close enough to be present. He didn't tell her to leave. He picked up the tea. It was exactly right. He didn't comment on this. She sat with her own cup and looked at the fire in the hearth, and was quiet in the particular way she was quiet. Not passive, not absent, but settled. The quietness of someone who has made peace with their own company over years of having mostly that. She wasn't asking him about the documents. She wasn't filling the silence with anything unnecessary. Just there. He worked. She sat. The fire moved through its slow cycles. Somewhere outside, a night bird. The occasional distant sound of the perimeter guards changing shift, far away and muffled. At some point, the chair had moved. He noticed it the way he kept noticing her movement toward him in retrospect, without a specific moment of arrival. She was closer to the desk than she'd been when she sat down. Not leaning in, not reading the documents, just closer. Her elbow was on the arm of the chair and her face was turned slightly toward the fire, and the angle meant she was perhaps 2 feet from his shoulder, and the space between them was warm and shared, and neither of them addressed it. His wolf was, if anything, even more obnoxiously satisfied than usual. She fell asleep in the chair at some point past midnight. Not the careful, held sleep of the previous days, something easier. Something that came on her gradually, the head settling, the cup held loosely in both hands in her lap, going still. He looked at her for a moment when he registered the change in her breathing. He got up quietly, took the cup from her hands, found the blanket folded at the end of the side settee and put it over her with the careful precision of someone doing a thing they have a very specific feeling about and are containing that feeling through extreme deliberate focus. He sat back down. He kept working. He didn't examine why he didn't wake her. He didn't need to. He knew. And his wolf knew. And the bracelet on his wrist was warm in the firelight, and she was 2 feet away, breathing slowly, safe, and for the first time in 7 years, the late hours in his study were not the worst hours of his day. They were something else entirely. She had a name, Petra Vane. Former nursing staff, Ironveil Medical, pack service record running 11 years before her abrupt and unexplained resignation, dated 4 months after Seraphine's recorded death. She had not died. As it turned out, unlike the physician, unlike the other nurse, she had simply gone very quiet and very small and very far away, to a village in the northern reaches of the Seraphine territory where the pack presence was thin and the administrative oversight thinner, the kind of place people went when they wanted to not be found by anyone who might be looking. Daxon's people found her in 9 days. She came to Ironveil not under any form of compulsion. Kael had been specific about that. Specific enough that Daxon had repeated the instruction back to him to confirm it, because it was a notable departure from how these things were typically handled. She was brought respectfully, her travel covered, her arrival made comfortable. She was told only that the Alpha King wished to speak with her regarding a medical matter from 7 years prior, and that she was not in any trouble, and that she would be free to leave when the conversation was concluded. She arrived looking like someone who had spent 7 years waiting for a knock on the door and was experiencing the complicated relief of finally hearing it. 60s, gray-haired, with the hands of someone who had spent a career in care work and eyes that had the permanent quality of someone carrying something they'd never been able to put down. Kael received her in a small private sitting room, not the formal council chamber, not the throne hall. Something that communicated, deliberately, that this was a conversation rather than an interrogation. He sat across from her rather than behind a desk. He had tea brought. He let her settle, and then he told her why she was there. He told her simply that the woman she had attended 7 years ago was alive, that she had been found, that she was here, in the palace, and that she had no memory of the events of that night or of the years preceding it. He told her this carefully, watching the woman's face throughout, and what moved across Petra Vane's face was not surprise. It was the complicated, terrible relief of someone who has kept a secret so long that the keeping of it has become indistinguishable from the thing they are keeping it from, and who has just been given permission to set it down. Her hands, folded in her lap, pressed together hard. "I knew," she said. Her voice was low, shaken, but not weak, the voice of someone who has rehearsed this moment in their own head enough times that when it finally arrived they could meet it standing. "I knew she wasn't dead. When they told me to sign the record, I knew." She looked at him directly. She was breathing when they took her. Her pulse was strong. The head injury was severe. Yes, it was serious. I won't minimize that, but she was not dying. She was not gone. I told them that. I told the physician that. And he looked at me and told me to sign the record and leave the room. Kael was very still. "Who gave the order?" he said. Quiet, not loud, the dangerous kind. She shook her head, not unwilling, just constrained. "I never saw a face. It came through the physician. He was frightened. I was frightened. Whatever pressure had been applied to him, it had been applied hard." She swallowed. "I signed. I left. I have not slept a full night since." He gave her a moment. He had questions, many. Specific, operational questions about chain of command and paperwork and who else had been in the room, and he would ask all of them. But he gave her a moment first, because she had been carrying this for 7 years, and she had come here and was telling the truth, and that deserved a moment. "There's more," she said. He waited. She looked at her hands, then back at him, with the particular look of someone who has decided that the only way through is straight through, regardless of what it costs. "When she was brought in that night," she said slowly, "she was already 2 months pregnant. The room was absolutely silent. She had been struck here." Petra touched the right side of her own temple precisely, "with something blunt and heavy. She was unconscious. She had been unconscious for some time before she arrived. We ran the standard intake assessment." She paused. The pregnancy was confirmed in that assessment, early but clear. Kael looked at her. His face was a wall. His hands were flat on his knees. His wolf was completely silent, not with the old empty silence, but the silence of something paying such total attention that it had gone completely still, the way a predator goes still when it has identified something that matters completely. "She was conscious at intervals," Petra continued, her voice lower now, "during the first hours. Before the swelling progressed. She kept asking for someone." She stopped. The look on her face was the look of a woman who has thought about this specific detail 10,000 times and still doesn't have a framework large enough to hold it. She wasn't coherent. She was in significant pain, but she kept asking. the same name, every time she surfaced. She looked at him. "She kept asking for you," she said. "She kept saying your name." The silence afterward was total. Kael. 7 years ago. With a fractured skull and someone else's paperwork being signed over her still-breathing body, his mate had surfaced from unconsciousness into pain and confusion and the certainty of loss, and reached for the only thing she knew was real. Him. His name. In her mouth. In the dark of a room where people were conspiring to erase her, reaching for him. And he had been 20 miles away, receiving the news of her death with no reason on earth to disbelieve it, holding the walls of himself up through sheer discipline, while his wolf went silent in his chest. The thing that moved through Kael then was beyond grief and beyond fury. It was something older and more structural than both of those, the kind of thing that happens in the deep foundation of a person when something they built their entire life around is revealed to have been built on a lie. His jaw was tight enough to ache. He pressed both hands flat on his knees, felt the pressure, used it. "The child," he said. His voice was barely above quiet. "She didn't know about the pregnancy when she was brought in?" "She was unconscious," Petra said. "She never knew. Not from us." He nodded once. Precise. The nod of a man who is recording information with the part of him that is still operational, because the rest of him requires a moment that he is not currently at liberty to take. He had been 20 miles away. She had been calling his name. He stood. Slowly. Not abruptly, everything careful, everything controlled, because the alternative was something he was not going to allow in front of a witness. "You'll be given accommodations for tonight," he said. "I have more questions. I'll need you available tomorrow morning." He paused. "You did the right thing. Coming here, telling me." Petra Vane looked up at him with those exhausted, long-carrying eyes. "I should have done it sooner," she said. He didn't answer that. There was no answer that helped. He walked to the door, his hand on the frame. The hallway beyond it was quiet and lamplit, and ordinary in the way that hallways are ordinary. The day continuing its business, the pack moving through its routines, everything proceeding as though the architecture of 7 years had not just been shown to be a construction, a deliberate, calculated, violently enforced construction over the top of something that had never actually ended. He stood there for one breath. 2. She had been calling his name. And somewhere in the west wing of this palace, in a room with afternoon light coming through tall windows over a garden running amber and red, she was sitting right now alive, real, warm, 2 months gone, when they wrote her death record, the mother of his daughter, the woman his wolf had never for a single moment stopped recognizing, reading, or resting, or talking to Leah, or simply being present in the world in the quiet, determined way she did everything. Alive. His. He had spent 7 years grieving a murder. Someone had taken her from him. He pressed one hand against the wall of the corridor and held it there until the pressure was enough. Then he straightened. Then he walked. He had a name to find. The name took 4 days to surface. Not because the trail was cold, it wasn't. Not anymore. Petra Vane had given them the thread, and Daxon's people had pulled it with the focused, methodical efficiency of investigators who understood that their alpha's patience on this particular matter had a specific and finite quality. They pulled records. They cross-referenced. They followed the chain of authorization backward, through 7 years of carefully maintained distance, through intermediaries and cutouts, and the particular kind of administrative laundering that only someone with deep institutional knowledge could have executed. The chain led, as these chains tend to lead when followed far enough, to someone close. His name was Lord Edric Valen, 63 years old, senior advisor to the late King Kael's father for 19 years before the old king's death, and retained in a consultative capacity by Kael himself in the early years of his reign, before Kael had quietly restructured the advisory council, and Edric had eased into a ceremonial role that carried a title, a stipend, and no actual access to anything that mattered. He had always seemed, in Kael's assessment, like a relic, a man who belonged to his father's era, operating with his father's values, fading gracefully into irrelevance. It turned out Kael had been wrong about the graceful part. He went himself. He didn't send Daxon. didn't send guards or investigators or anyone with a formal function. He went alone, on a cold morning when the frost was still on the grass of the pack grounds and the sky had the flat, white quality of a day that had decided not to commit to anything. He went to Edric's residence, comfortable, large, sitting at the edge of the pack's noble quarter, the house of a man who had served power long enough to accumulate the trappings of it without ever quite holding it himself, and he knocked on the door. Edric answered personally. He was in his morning robe. He had clearly been eating breakfast. He looked at Kael on his doorstep with the particular expression of a man who has been waiting for something for a very long time and has simultaneously hoped it would never arrive. That expression, more than anything else, confirmed every single thing the documents had said. Kael looked at him for a moment. Then he stepped inside without being invited. They sat in Edric's study. Kael had not been in this room before, and he took it in briefly, the shelves, the papers, the careful accumulation of a long life in service to the pack's power structures. A room that smelled like old ambition and the particular mustiness of a man who spent his days among records. He laid the documents on Edric's desk, all of them. The falsified medical report, the replaced archive copy, the resignation records for both nurses, the death record, the travel records placing 2 of Edric's known intermediaries in the Eastern Territory in the months following Seraphine's disappearance. He laid them out one by one, without speaking, in the way that a case is laid out when it is complete, and the purpose of the laying is not persuasion but declaration. Then he sat back and looked at the old man. Edric looked at the documents for a long moment. His hands were flat on the arms of his chair. His face had gone through several things in quick succession: denial, calculation, the assessment of whether there was still a version of this conversation he could navigate, and had arrived, finally, at something that looked almost like relief. The relief of a man who has been running from something for 7 years and is too old and too tired to keep running. He confessed without being asked. He began with the political architecture of it, which was where men like Edric always began, in the abstract, in the strategic, in the framework that made the decision look like logic rather than what it was. 7 years ago, the Ironveil pack had been in a particular moment of political vulnerability. Kael's father had been failing, the illness not yet public, but known to those close to the throne. The succession was certain, but the alliances that would support it were not. The Eastern Territories, specifically, the Greyveil pack, powerful and historically neutral, had been moving toward a formal alliance with a rival bloodline. An alliance marriage had been the solution. Lord Greyveil's eldest daughter, politically ideal, pack-approved, the kind of union that would have solved 3 problems simultaneously. And then Kael had found his true mate. Edric described this with the tone of a man describing a weather event, something that arrived and disrupted plans, as natural forces do. The mate bond, once activated, was politically inflexible. Kael would not have been persuaded to set it aside. Edric had known that, had apparently known it from the moment he saw the way Kael looked at Seraphine, had understood with the cold clarity of a man who has spent his life reading the room that no political argument was going to move an alpha from a true mate bond. So he hadn't tried. He had simply removed her instead. The plan had been, Edric explained, with the careful voice of someone who has rehearsed the telling of it in their own head for years, never intended to be permanent harm. Kael said nothing to this. His face said nothing. His hands on the desk said nothing. He let Edric hear himself say it and continue. She was to be relocated. Her memories erased. There were people who could do that, Edric said. Specialists. It had been done before in pack history when the political need was great enough. It was not a common thing, but it was a known thing and placed somewhere distant and comfortable. The plan had been clean. What had not been planned was the resistance. Seraphine had fought. The men sent to take her had expected a frightened woman and encountered instead a she-wolf with a true mate bond, at full activation, not shifted, not able to shift in that state, but fighting in the pure, primal, desperate way of someone whose every instinct was screaming that what was happening could not be allowed to happen. She had fought, and in the fighting, the blow intended to subdue her had been applied with too much force. The men had panicked. The decision to escalate from disappearance to death record had been made in that panic, by Edric's intermediary on the ground, ratified by Edric himself in the hours following when the full situation was reported back. It was tidier, he had decided. More permanent. No loose threads. The fact that she had survived, the fact that she had been breathing when she was transported, that the attending physician had noted a strong pulse, that she had been deposited in that eastern field alive, with a fractured skull and no name, and a pregnancy no one knew about, was not by his design. It was the failure of men he had trusted to be thorough. He finished. The study was silent. Kael had not moved, had not spoken, had not changed his expression during any of it, the expression having been locked into something so far below hot that it had no name in the ordinary vocabulary of anger. He had sat across from an old man and listened to the complete accounting of how his mate had been taken from him, how his daughter had spent her first years in the world without him, how 7 years of his life had been built on a lie constructed in a panicked room by men carrying out someone else's deliberate decision. He stood. Edric flinched, actually physically flinched, as though expecting something immediate and physical, the primal response to an alpha who has reached the end of a very long leash. What Kael did was pick up the documents, one by one, precisely, back into the folder. "You will be escorted to the holding facility within the hour," he said. His voice was completely, terrifyingly even. "You will be held pending formal pack tribunal. You will be given representation. The process will be correct." He looked at Edric directly. "I am telling you this because the tribunal will be public, and the pack will know the full accounting of what you did, and you will face a consequence that is proportional and documented and entirely legitimate." A pause so brief and so weighted that the silence inside it had more presence than most sounds. "Because the alternative, what I would do without a process, is not something I will permit myself. Not today, not with her waiting at the palace." He picked up the folder. He walked to the door. "Kael," the old man said. His voice had changed. Something in it that wasn't quite apology and wasn't quite plea, but was the last card of a man who had nothing else to play. "Your father didn't know. I want you to know that. He didn't—" "I know," Kael said, without turning. "He would never have permitted it." A pause. "Which is why you waited until he was too ill to be consulted." He left. He walked back through the frost-covered grounds with his hands at his sides and the folder under his arm and the flat white sky above him, saying nothing. And he managed the distance between Edric's house and the palace gates with the last of the iron he had left, because what was inside him right now needed the palace walls around it before it could be anything other than controlled. He needed to see her. He just needed to see that she was there. She was in the corridor. He nearly walked into her, not literally, his senses registering her presence around the corner before he turned it, but close. She was coming from the direction of the archive room, the small one adjacent to the pack library that had been opened for her use at her quiet request 2 days prior. She had been spending time there in the late mornings while Leah was in lessons with the pack's youngest teacher, a young woman named Fen who had taken to the child with an enthusiasm that was entirely mutual and had been one of the better spontaneous arrangements of the last weeks. She was holding something, a photograph, old, the kind printed on thick paper stock, the colors slightly muted with age, the edges worn at the corners from having been handled many times over the years by someone who kept it somewhere accessible. It was face down against her chest, pressed there with both hands the way you press something when you need a moment before you look at it again. Her hands were shaking. Not the shaking of cold or illness, the fever had been gone for a week. This was something else. The shaking of a nervous system that has just received information it doesn't know what to do with. The trembling that happens in the gap between receiving something and processing it. She looked up when she heard him. Her face stopped him. It was open in a way he hadn't seen it. The careful composure she always held, not cold, never cold, but held, managed. The practiced steadiness of someone who had learned to navigate the world as an unknown quantity was fractured. Not gone, but fractured. And what was showing through the fractures was something so raw and so unguarded that he stopped moving entirely and simply looked at her. Her eyes were bright, not crying. The step before crying, where everything is gathered and the question is still open. "I found this," she said. Her voice was careful in the way that voices get when the speaker is managing something large by being very precise about everything surrounding it. "In the archive room, in a folder of old pack documentation. It had fallen behind one of the lower shelves, I think. It wasn't filed anywhere, it had just slipped." She stopped. She turned the photograph over. He looked at it. He knew it. He knew it the way he knew the bracelet. It had been taken in the pack gardens, the same gardens that were currently running amber and red outside the West Wing windows on a late afternoon in early autumn. The light doing what the light did at that hour in that garden, warm and oblique and golden in the way that made everything look permanent. They were not posed. It had been candid, taken by Daxon, who had had a camera and an opportunity and had used both without announcing it, and had given Kael the print the following week, with the particular straight-faced composure of a man delivering something meaningful, while maintaining the ability to deny any sentiment was involved. They were sitting on the stone bench near the far wall. Seraphine was turned slightly toward him, saying something he couldn't remember what. He had never been able to remember what from the angle of her face, had spent years wishing he could, and he was looking at her. Not at the camera, at her. The way he looked at her in those days, when he was still young enough and whole enough that the feeling didn't need managing, when it was just true and present and visible. The way, he realized slowly, he was already learning to look at her again. He looked up from the photograph. She was watching him, hands still shaking slightly, eyes still that bright, gathered, on-the-edge quality. "I know this place," she said. Her voice had dropped to something just above a whisper, not because she was trying to be quiet, because anything louder would have required more structural integrity than she currently had. "I recognized it. When I found it, She stopped, swallowed. "I know the garden. I've been looking at it from the window every morning, and I've been feeling something when I look at it, and I haven't known why. But when I saw this photograph," her hands pressed the photograph harder against her chest for a moment, then lowered again. "I know it. I know this place in a way that I don't know anything else. In a way that's different." She looked at the photograph again. At herself in it. At the face of a woman who was smiling at something being said by the man beside her. Comfortable and warm and entirely, completely unaware that she was living in the last weeks of a before. "And I know this man," she said, very quietly. Kael stepped forward. He took the photograph from her hands gently, giving her the chance to resist if she wanted to. And she didn't resist, and he held it for a moment, looking at it himself. Then he looked at her. "That's you," he said. His voice came out low and careful, the way you speak near something that is fragile, not in a bad way but in a significant way. "And me." The silence that followed was the most significant silence in 7 years. She looked at him. Not with the confusion that had been there at the gate, not with the careful assessment of someone calibrating an unknown situation, something different. Something that was trying to find its footing and kept finding none because the ground beneath it was moving, had been moving since the moment she arrived at his gate, had been moving in ways she could feel but couldn't name, and had been trying to manage with logic and steadiness and the same stubborn self-sufficiency that had gotten her through 7 years of being no one in particular. The tears came without warning. Not dramatic, not loud, the kind that arrive before the decision to cry is made, that bypass the permission structure entirely and simply happen a single one first, and then the release of something held too long. The particular grief of crying for something you can't fully identify, except that it feels like loss and recognition at the same time, like reaching for something in the dark, and finding it exactly where your hand knew to go without knowing how it knew. She pressed her hand to her mouth. He crossed the remaining space between them. He didn't think about it, didn't measure it or manage it or apply any of the careful, disciplined distance he had been maintaining. He simply moved, and his arms went around her, and she was there warm, real, her forehead dropping forward against his chest the way it had always done. The particular fit of her against him that his body had never stopped knowing, even when his mind had been trying to believe she was gone and she didn't pull back. She didn't understand why it felt safe. He could feel that in her, the slight tension of someone allowing something they haven't fully rationalized, the body already settled while the mind was still asking questions. She was crying against his chest without knowing the whole of what she was crying for. One hand pressed to the fabric of his coat, not gripping, just touching, like someone who has found solid ground in the dark and is not yet sure whether to trust it, but is too exhausted to move away. He didn't speak. He didn't explain or justify or say any of the things that were true and enormous and waiting. Not now. Not while she was here and fragile and open in a way she hadn't been since the gate, since the fever, since all of it. Not now. He held her. His wolf was absolutely still. The complete and total stillness of something that has been in pain for a very long time and has just been given the one specific thing that stops the pain. Not healed, not fixed. Not the complicated, uncertain road ahead of them, or the things she didn't know yet, or the things he would need to tell her, and the ways those things would break her open again before they put her back together. Just this. Just now. Her weight against him and her breathing slowly evening and his arms around a person he had buried and mourned and wept for and built 7 years of gray emptiness around the absence of. Her hand shifted against his coat, finding purchase. Her fingers curled. He pressed his hand to the back of her head, gentle and absolute, the way you hold something irreplaceable. Outside, The amber garden was perfectly still. The morning light came through the corridor windows in long, even bars, falling across the stone floor, falling across two people standing in a palace hallway with 7 years between them and no distance left at all, and the photograph face up on the floor where it had fallen, showing a woman smiling at a man who was looking at her like she was the only fixed point in his world. She didn't know yet. She would. But right now she was crying in his arms for a loss she couldn't name, and his arms were around her, and she wasn't pulling away. And that for this moment, for right now, in this hallway with the photograph on the floor and the garden outside and his wolf finally quiet in his chest, that was enough. He called the full pack assembly 3 days after Edric's arrest. Not a council meeting. Not a closed session with the elders in the obsidian-walled chamber where difficult things got managed quietly and efficiently and out of public view. A full assembly, every adult member of the Ironveil pack, gathered in the great yard at the center of the pack grounds, the space used for ceremonies and declarations and the rare, weighty moments when an alpha needed his people to hear something directly from him, rather than through the soft distortions of rumor and corridor whisper. Word had already been moving through the pack for 2 days. Edric's arrest had not been invisible, these things never were. In a pack this size, where everyone knew the name and the face and the history of a man who had sat at the old king's right hand for nearly 2 decades, there had been shock. There had been the particular low hum of a community that has been told something is happening but not what, and is filling the silence with its own interpretations, some accurate and some far from it. Kael was going to give them the truth, all of it. He stood on the raised platform at the head of the great yard and looked out at his people, hundreds of them, standing in the cold morning air, breath visible, coats pulled close, the whole of them quiet, in that specific way. A pack goes quiet when its alpha is about to speak, attentive, waiting, the kind of silence that has weight and attention behind it rather than just the absence of sound. He told them everything, not in the measured, diplomatic phrasing of political communication, not with the careful hedging of someone managing a narrative plainly, the way he handled everything that mattered. What had happened 7 years ago, what had been done to his mate, by whom, and why, the falsified death record, the destroyed medical documentation, the deliberate, calculated removal of a woman from his life and from the life of the pack, ordered by a man who had served this pack for nearly 20 years, and had decided that his own assessment of what was politically advantageous outweighed the life and the rights and the sacred bond of his alpha's true mate. He told them about the ring she still wore, about the daughter who had his eyes, about the 7 years she had spent in an eastern village with no name, no memory, and nothing but a child, and a stubborn refusal to stop standing upright. The yard was absolutely silent throughout. Not the silence of shock, though shock was there, he could see it, moving through the crowd in small visible ripples, the slight changes in posture, the hands pressed to mouths, the faces of people recalibrating in real time. Something else held the silence together, something more like the particular quality of communal feeling that a pack can have, when it is genuinely a pack, the shared weight of something that happened to one of their own and had happened to all of them by extension. When he finished, the silence held for another moment. Then Elder Corvain stepped forward. Kael watched him come, prepared if necessary, for the old argument in new clothes, the pragmatic case, the political case, the case for stability and measured process, and perhaps not airing this particular history in this particular public forum. Corvain stopped at the base of the platform steps. He looked up at Kael for a long moment with the face of a man who has spent 40 years in political life and has just decided, perhaps for the first time in a while, to be simply and directly honest. "Tell us what you need from us," he said. "My lord." Kael looked at him. "Bear witness," Kael said. "That's all. Bear witness to what was done and to what is being corrected. That's what I need from my pack." Corvain nodded once, turned back to the assembly, and the pack held the moment together in the way packs do, not with noise, not with declarations, but with the communal, unanimous weight of being present for something real. She had watched from the upper gallery. He had asked her, the evening before, whether she wanted to be present, had sat across from her in the study, their late-night study, as he had come to think of it privately, the room that had been his alone for 7 years, and had become something else over the last weeks, and had laid out the choice plainly. She could stand beside him on the platform. She could watch from the gallery. She could stay in the West Wing entirely, away from all of it, and he would tell her everything after. She had thought about it for a long time, long enough that the fire burned through one full sequence of it settling and shifting, Then she had said quietly that she would watch from the gallery. He had nodded and asked nothing more about it. She was still there when he came up after standing at the gallery railing with her hands wrapped around it, looking out over the yard where the assembly was dispersing, the crowd moving apart in small groups in the cold morning air. She didn't turn when he came to stand beside her. They stood together at the railing for a moment, looking out at the same view, close enough that the cold air couldn't quite reach the space between them. "That was for me," she said. Not a question. Not accusation either. Something in the middle. Something that was processing the weight of what she had just watched and trying to find where to put it. "It was for the pack," he said. "And yes, it was for you." She was quiet for a moment. He could feel her turning something over the same internal quality she had when she was thinking something through that mattered. The slight stillness of her hands on the railing. "Does it change things?" she asked. "For them. For the pack. Knowing what happened. It changes everything," he said. "Which is what it needed to do." She turned to look at him. He was already looking at her. He was always already looking at her. He had accepted this about himself, and she found his gaze directly, the way she always did, unguarded, direct. Even now, even carrying everything she was carrying, there was nothing evasive about the way she looked at him. It was one of the many things about her that undid him consistently, and that he had no defense against. Her eyes were bright. Not the bright of tears, not the on-the-edge quality of the photograph corridor, something else. Something that was arriving, slowly and incompletely but undeniably, from somewhere deeper than the surface. Something the morning and the assembly and the 7 years and the ring on her finger and all of it was pushing upward toward the light. She opened her mouth, closed it, tried again. He waited. He was very good at waiting for her. "Kael," she said. Just that. His name. In her mouth. After 7 years. Not called through pain and confusion in a medical room she wouldn't remember. Not the name on the back of a photograph she'd found behind a shelf. Said here, in the ordinary cold air of a winter morning, by a woman looking directly at him with eyes that were just beginning to know him again, said as though it had always been there, as though her mouth had always known its shape, as though it fit exactly the way it always had. He didn't move, didn't speak, let it be what it was. She looked at him with that name still in the air between them, and something in her face said that she felt it too, the rightness of it, the particular click of something settling into alignment. She didn't have context for it yet. She didn't have the full architecture of why his name in her mouth felt like coming home. But she felt the feeling, and she didn't look away from it, and that was everything. "Kael," she said again, testing it, making sure it was real. "Yes," he said quietly. She looked at him for one more long moment. Then she turned back to the railing and looked out at the garden below, where the amber had been replaced by the first thin frost, and she didn't say anything else. She didn't have to. The memories came back in fragments first. That was how physician Aldrich had described the process, not a return but a reconstruction. The brain finding new roots around scarred tissue, building slowly, beginning not with full scenes but with pieces, sensory shards, the smell of something that wasn't present, a sound without a source, the feeling of a specific texture under fingers that weren't touching anything. She had begun working with a specialist Aldrich recommended, a quiet, precise woman named Dr. Corin, who came to the palace 3 times a week and sat with Sarah in the small sitting room adjacent to the West Wing in sessions that ran an hour, sometimes 2. Kael was never present for the sessions. He had made this boundary clearly and kept it clearly, because there were things she needed to find without him standing in the room, generating the particular gravitational pull that his wolf apparently exerted on her body, whether he was trying to or not. She told him, in the evenings, what she was comfortable telling him. Small things at first. The smell of pine resin, strong, specific, attached to a feeling she couldn't name, but that was warm rather than frightening. The sound of water moving fast over rock. The color of a sky at a particular hour of late afternoon, amber shading into gold at the horizon, that produced in her chest something so large and so ungriefable that she had to sit with it for several minutes before she could continue. He listened to all of it, every fragment. He did not identify them for her. Aldrich had been clear that the reconstruction was most complete when it came from within, rather than being scaffolded from outside. But he held each piece she offered with a care that she could, apparently, feel, because she kept offering more. And then, on a Tuesday morning in the 5th week of the sessions, everything broke open. Dr. Corin found him in the corridor outside the study at midday. She was not a woman who showed much externally professional, contained, the particular composure of someone who regulated their own reactions as a matter of occupational practice. But there was something in her face when she found him that was different from her usual neutrality, something careful and significant. "She's asking for you," she said. I think you need to come now." He was already moving. He crossed the palace in the fastest walk that wasn't running, not because running was beneath him, not at this moment, but because he was managing everything he had in order to arrive at wherever she was with something intact. She was in the sitting room, standing, not sitting, not curled in the corner of the settee the way she sometimes was after difficult sessions, standing in the middle of the room with both hands pressed to her sternum, like someone trying to hold themselves together from the outside, while something enormous moved through the inside. She heard the door. She turned. Her face. He stopped in the doorway. He had seen her face in many states over these weeks, exhausted, careful, wry, fragile, stubborn, open on the edge of tears, just past them. He had memorized this current version of her face the way he had memorized every version before it. He had never seen this. Her eyes were fully, completely open. Not in the ordinary sense, in the specific sense of someone for whom a door has been opened that had been sealed for years. Someone through whom light is coming from a direction it hasn't come from in a very long time. Her face was wet. She was not making any effort to manage this. Both hands were still pressed to her chest. She looked at him the way she had never looked at him in these weeks. Not the ripple, not the almost, not the unnamed thing just below the surface. Recognition. Complete, full, devastating recognition. "Our first meeting," she said. Her voice was fractured at the edges and completely certain in the center. "The Eastern market. I was arguing with a merchant about the weight on a scale, and you came over and corrected him without being asked, and I told you that I didn't need help, and you said you wasn't helping me. You were helping the merchant understand mathematics." The words were coming fast now, the particular speed of someone pulling things from a place they've suddenly regained access to before anything can close again. And I laughed. I told you your intervention was entirely unnecessary and laughed anyway. And you smiled at me like that, and I thought... She stopped. Her breath shook. I thought, this is going to be a problem. He crossed the room. He couldn't not. She kept going, even as he came toward her, even as the space closed between them, words spilling out of her as though held under pressure for years and finally given a vent. The bond ceremony, the garden at sunset. You couldn't remember the third vow and Elder Corvain was doing the face and you looked at me and whispered, "I help me like I wasn't the person you were vowing to." And I was absolutely not supposed to laugh during a bonding ceremony. But I did anyway, and Corvain pretended not to notice. He reached her. His arms went around her. And she came into them, not the tentative, uncertain contact of the photograph corridor, not the fragile allowing of someone who felt something they couldn't name. She came into them with the full weight of someone who knows exactly where they are, and has been trying to find this place for 7 years, and cannot quite believe they are back. Her arms went around him, tight. Her hands pressed into his back. Her face went to his shoulder, and she held on with the grip of someone who has been lost for a very long time, and is making absolutely certain they do not accidentally let go. "The night they came," she said. Her voice was muffled against his coat. Still going. She needed to say it all. He understood that. "I heard them on the stairs. I knew something was wrong. I knew it before they got to the door. I was going to call for you. I reached for a sharp breath, the shape of the memory clearly hitting something that still hurt even 7 years removed. They were faster. The last thing I remember is thinking your name. Thinking Kael like you'd hear it. Like it would reach you somehow." His arms tightened around her. He pressed his face to the top of her head. His eyes were closed. His wolf was making a sound he had no adequate description for. Something that lived below language, below anything expressible. The sound of a thing that has been in tremendous pain for a very long time, and has just been released from it. Not triumphant. Not loud, just released. The way a breath is released. The way a fist finally opens. The way a season that has been going on too long finally turns. She was shaking slightly. Not from cold. The good shaking, the kind the body does when it is processing something too large for it to absorb all at once. "I remember you," she said. Not past tense. Not I remembered. The present tense, immediate, ongoing, right here. "I remember you. You specifically. This person. These arms. This shoulder. This specific warmth that has existed in my body as an absence for 7 years, and is now, right now, present again. Kael, I remember you. He couldn't speak. He held her instead. He held her with everything he had, not the restrained, careful hold of a man managing his wolf, not the measured comfort of someone keeping appropriate distance, everything. The full truth of 7 years of carrying something that had no resolution, pressed into the reality of her being alive and here and whole and remembering him. His wolf settled. That was the only word for it. Not silenced, not suppressed. Settled. The way a river settles after flood, still moving, still present, still powerful, but no longer straining against its own banks. It curled around the warmth of her like something finally, permanently home, and it was quiet in the way that only deep and genuine peace is quiet. They stayed like that for a long time. She kept her arms around him. He kept his around her. The sitting room was very still around them, the winter light coming through the windows white and even, the fire in the hearth moving through its patient cycles. At some point her breathing slowed, evened. The shaking stopped. She turned her face slightly against his shoulder, and he felt rather than saw the long exhale of someone putting something down that they have been carrying alone for much too long. I'm angry, she said eventually, quiet, against his coat. I know, he said. I'm going to need time to be angry properly. I know. And then, I'm going to need... She stopped. He felt her gather herself. I'm going to need you to tell me everything. All of it. Not today, but everything. Everything, he confirmed. Whenever you're ready. Nothing withheld. A pause. Her arms didn't loosen. But right now, she said, I just need to stay here for a minute. He pressed his hand to the back of her head, gentle and absolute. Stay as long as you need, he said. Snow came to Ironveil on a Thursday. The first real snow of the winter, not the thin, apologetic dusting of early cold, but actual snow, coming down thick and even in the small hours of the morning and continuing through dawn, covering the garden and the courtyard and the pack grounds in the specific, complete silence that heavy snowfall produces. The kind of snow that changes the quality of light inside as much as out, making everything in every room softer and more suspended. The world gone quiet and white and new outside every window. Kael woke before the house did. He dressed in the dark and went to his study and stood at the window for a time, looking out at the garden he had looked at from this window for 7 years. It looked different now. He had noticed this increasingly over the past months, the way familiar things look different when you were no longer looking at them from inside grief. Not brighter, not more colorful, just more present. Like the difference between seeing something on a page and seeing it in the world. He heard small feet. He turned. Leah was in the doorway in her sleep clothes, hair loose and tangled from sleep, holding something against her chest with both arms in the particular way she held things she considered important. She saw him and came directly in without knocking. She had never knocked in her life, not once, and he had stopped expecting it with the cheerful resignation of a man who has accepted certain facts about his daughter's personality. She climbed into the chair across from his desk and pulled her knees up and set the thing she was carrying on the desk surface. A piece of paper, slightly crumpled, covered in the bright, deliberate lines of a child's careful drawing. He leaned forward and looked at it. 3 wolves, standing side by side. Done in crayon, one large and dark, one smaller and lighter, one very small between them and slightly in front, which from its proportions was clearly meant to be the artist herself. They were standing on snow, or something white. They were holding hands, in the manner of wolves who apparently had hands, which Leah had not allowed anatomical accuracy to prevent her from depicting. Their tails were up. Underneath, in the uneven, determined print of a child, who had recently become very serious about writing. Family. He looked at it for a long moment. Did you draw this last night? He asked. She nodded. I was going to give it to you and Mama together, but I woke up early and you were already here. She looked at it too, with the evaluating expression of an artist assessing their own work and finding it mostly satisfactory. The middle one's Mama, she added, pointing, in case there was any ambiguity. And that one's you, and that's me. He looked at the drawing, at the 3 wolves holding hands in the snow with their tails up. Are we a real pack now? She asked. She said it the way she said everything directly, without preamble, the question having been clearly in her mind and now being transferred to the air between them as the most efficient way to get it answered. Her amber eyes on his face, patient and steady and entirely unafraid of whatever answer was coming. He looked at his daughter, at her mother's jaw and his eyes, and the particular fearless certainty that was entirely her own, that had always been entirely her own, From the moment she appeared in a rainy courtyard and looked up at the most powerful alpha in 4 territories and asked him if he was lonely without a moment's hesitation. He thought about Sarah, asleep in the West Wing right now. 3 months past the day she had run to him with 7 years of memory finally breaking open in her chest, still navigating the complicated daily work of holding anger and grief and recovery and love all at the same time. Still fighting and still stubborn and still, every single evening, bringing 2 cups of tea to the study and sitting in the chair that had become her chair while the fire went through its cycles. Still drifting toward him without noticing. Still wearing the ring. He thought about the bracelet on his wrist worn through and re-knotted so many times it was more repair than original now, more stubbornness than cord, and the way she had looked at it when he finally told her what it was and why he'd kept it, and the way she hadn't said anything for a long moment, and then had taken his wrist in both hands and held it there, as though trying to feel 7 years through the weave of old thread. He reached across the desk and picked up the drawing, held it, looked at the 3 wolves in the snow. "We always were," he said. Leah looked at the drawing in his hands, then at him. Something settled in her face the way things settle in a child's face when an answer lands as true, when the thing they hoped would be said is actually said, and turns out to be even more real than they hoped. She unfolded from the chair, came around the desk, and without announcement or permission, with the absolute confidence of someone who has never once doubted her right to do this, she climbed into his lap and put her head against his chest and was still. He closed his arm around her. She was warm, small and warm and entirely real, and here, this child who had walked into his rain-soaked courtyard and seen straight through every wall he had ever built, who had climbed into his throne hall before dawn and sat on the steps like she owned them, who had gone and found him and brought him back to her mother, with the serene, unhurried authority of someone who had always known exactly how this was supposed to go. Outside, the snow kept falling, white and even and silent, covering the pack grounds and the garden and the stone of the great yard and the bench in the corner where a candid photograph had once been taken on an autumn afternoon by a beta with a camera and more sentiment than he would ever admit. 2. Inside, the fire in the hearth was warm, and from somewhere down the corridor soft footsteps, the particular, familiar cadence he could identify now in his sleep, among any crowd, at any distance, the sound of his mate moving through the palace in the early morning, awake early the way she always was, drawn perhaps by the snowlight or by the voices or by whatever it was that seemed to pull her toward him even now, even with all her memories back, even without needing to be pulled, still arriving at doors he was behind, still filling rooms he was in, still taking up exactly the space in the world that she had always been supposed to take up, and that had been a wound-shaped absence for 7 years. The door opened. She stood in the frame, hair loose, a blanket pulled around her shoulders, her eyes still carrying the soft edges of sleep. She looked at Leah in his lap, and at the drawing in his hand, and at the snow outside the window. Then she looked at him. He looked back. No ripple. No almost. No unnamed thing struggling toward the surface. Just Seraphine, looking at Kael, in the complete and ordinary and extraordinary way of someone who knows exactly who they are looking at and has chosen, with full knowledge and full memory and full understanding of everything it cost to get here, to be in this room. She crossed to the chair, her chair, and sat down. She pulled the blanket around herself. She looked at the snow. "It's beautiful," she said quietly. He looked at his daughter, asleep against his chest now, between one breath and the next, the way children fall asleep completely and without warning. He looked at his mate in the chair with the winter light on her face and the ring on her hand, and 7 years of survival quietly present in the set of her jaw. He looked at the drawing still in his hand. 3 wolves in the snow. Family. Yes, he said. The snow kept falling outside, soft and even and covering everything, and inside the study the fire was warm, and his wolf was settled, and his daughter was asleep in his arms, and his mate was in the chair across from him, and the world outside the windows was white and quiet and entirely, completely new. Thank you for listening to another emotional, magical shifter romance here on Moonbound Romance Tales. If you enjoyed today's story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, so you never miss more powerful, heart-gripping romance stories.